Over the years, I've made a good number of ecosystems with working waterfalls inside, and in this video I've put together some of my favourite. Hopefully you can find some inspiration or just sit back and enjoy. Now let's jump straight into the first build where I create a Nanopaladarium with a double waterfall. In this video I'll show you how to make a lush Nanopaladarium with not one but two flowing waterfalls. Stick around to the end as I'm even going to show you how it evolves from day 1 all the way up to day 80. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. What I'll be using is this glass tank that I built myself from picture frame glass. It's got a hinged door and a leveling mat on the bottom. I've shown how to make these tanks plenty of times before, so if you want to learn how, check out the video on screen now. One important feature is this small gap in the top. This will play a key role in the waterfall working properly. The idea I've got for this build isn't just one waterfall, as I think I want two waterfalls on either side of the paludarium. The first thing that I'm doing is placing a foam mat inside the tank, which is going to help protect the glass from the rocks that are about to go inside. The stones I've selected for this build are known as georocks, and they're one of my favourites due to their detailed texture. To add to the hardscape even further, I'm going to use a few pieces of bogwood as well. I'm starting by placing in some georocks to try and create a base that the wood can then go on top of. Despite having a picture in my head, it still takes a whole lot of trial and error to try and make it come to life. After a short while, I think I've achieved something that I like. The left and right piece of wood are going to be where the waterfalls flow down. A few more small pieces of rock will help fill in the gaps around the base and add a bit more detail. As is, the hardscape is very unstable, so I'm going to need to lock it down. As you might have guessed, the easiest and most reliable way of doing this is with the super glue and tissue method. I'm taking a small piece of tissue and wedging it between the wood and rock and then soaking it with some liquid type super glue. It dries really fast and forms a strong and safe bond. With the hardscape nice and solid, it's time to move on to the next step. Instead of placing a pump inside the tank, which would certainly be hard to fit and even harder to clean, I'm going to use an external canister filter. I built this filter myself, and I do have a tutorial on the channel showing you exactly how to make one. I'm going to use these long plastic straws as intake and output pipes inside the paludarium. They both fit perfectly inside the gap that I left in the lid. To start off, I'm going to create the intake as I think it's going to be the easiest. I'm using a sharp blade to cut a notch out the bottom, which will allow it to pull up water. It's certainly not the neatest, but it should work just fine. I'll definitely place in some filter foam around it just to make sure it doesn't get clogged up. As for the top, I think it's going to work much better at a 90-degree angle instead of coming straight out. I'm using some electrical tape to block up one end of the straw. Now I'm going to flip it round and fill the straw up with some fine sand. A small funnel makes this task much easier. Now that the straw's filled up, I'm going to cover the other end with some more tape to lock it all inside. This is a jig that I'm going to use to bend the straw to the correct angle. To bend it, it needs to be heated up, and a lighter is a simple and easy way to do this. I'm doing my best to heat it up very gradually and evenly, as you don't want the flame to burn the plastic. Now that it's nice and soft, I'm going to go ahead and bend it at a 90-degree angle. After holding it in place for about 20 seconds, it's cooled down enough to stay in place. The reason I filled the straw up with sand is because it stops it from collapsing in on itself when bending it. With the tape and sand removed, I can place it inside, and as you can see, it fits in perfectly. Now it's time to work on the output pipe, which is going to be slightly more complicated, especially as I want two waterfalls. Using the exact same methods that I just showed you, I've gone ahead and created all the parts that I think I need. The hole in this straw was created by heating up a screwdriver and simply melting it through. As for attaching these pieces together, I'm going to use these small pieces of silicone tubing. It's all quite fiddly to install, but I've tried to create them in a way that makes them completely invisible once the tank is complete. This is the output for the waterfall on the left, and this small one is the output for the waterfall on the right. I'm expecting the flow on the left to be significantly weaker than the right as it's got a lot more distance to travel, but hopefully it'll make its way out. The only things that need to be attached with glue is the output on the right that goes into the hole in the centre of the straw, and then pinning the output on the left behind the driftwood. I'm really happy with how discreet the pipework is, and once the plants are in, I think it's going to be almost invisible. Before moving on, I want to set up the filter and give the waterfalls a quick test run. I'm using some silicone tubing to attach the filter to the input and output pipes. Now I'm priming the filter by simply filling it up with some water. This is important to do as it won't run if you don't do this. As expected, the left side is significantly weaker than the right, but after some time it did start to even out. It's great to see the filter working just as I planned, and it's super quiet, which is always a plus. Later on, I'll place things in like moss and plants around the outputs to help the water flow down over the wood a bit more naturally. Now that I know the waterfalls are working as they should, let's move on with the build. I'm going to use this sharp blade to cut out the excess foam at the base of the tank. Next, I'm going to place in some filter foam around the intake pipe. This will prevent large objects from being sucked up by the pump, which could potentially block it. I'm also going to use the foam to fill in these gaps in the hardscape. I'm going to be pouring substrate behind the hardscape soon, and if I leave these gaps open, it's simply going to spill into the foreground. For this paladarium, I'm going to try something really simple for the substrate. This is some fine leaker, and it's all I'm going to use for the substrate layer. I've never used it as a standalone substrate before, so I'm really curious to see how it gets on. If it does end up working out, it's going to be a massive win, as this stuff is really quite cheap in comparison to aquasoil, which is what I'll usually use. I'll probably add some more later to cover up the pipework, but for now I'm going to start working on the foreground. I'm starting with just a layer of fine sand. Although it looks better, it certainly doesn't look too natural, so let's fix that by giving it some contrast and detail. I'm starting with some fine gravel and pouring it pretty much everywhere. Next, I'm going to do the same with some small pea gravel, but add slightly less. Finally, I'll add some larger pea gravel, followed by a light dusting of sand to finish it off. Just by adding a bit more variety in stones and gravel, you can see how much more natural it looks. Before I can add any plants, I need to do a couple things. I'm giving the paladarium a really good spray down, and then I'm going to install a black background on the back panel of glass. I think this will help frame in the scape much better, as you simply won't be able to see what's behind it. To create a background on a budget, you can simply tape on a black piece of paper. Now I think it's about time to start bringing the paladarium to life with some plants. The first plant going in is trident fern. I'm mainly going to plant it around the inside and outside of the wood to help hide all the pipework. This, along with all the other plants I'll be using, are sold as aquatic plants, but they grow great inside paladariums due to the high humidity. I'm already loving how it looks, and it's only going to get better and better as I've got plenty more plants to come. Next, I'm going to plant in some Anubias and Bucephalandra. I think the small, delicate leaves of these plants are going to add some nice detail to the paludarium. I can plant the majority of them by wedging them inside gaps and cracks, but for the ones that I can't, I'm using a small amount of gel type superglue. These types of plants are prone to drying out, so keeping them damp really is essential. The next plant to go in is this crypt. I'm going to plant it into the leaker right in the centre. This plant is quite demanding of nutrients, so it's going to be interesting to see how it gets on with no real substrate. To fill in more of the background, I'm going to plant in some hygrophila. I absolutely love the unique detail in this plant's leaves, and I think it adds a natural look to whatever scape it goes in. I've still got a few plants to add, but before doing so, I'm going to fill the tank up with water. Just like always, I'm placing a small piece of paper towel inside the tank to stop the water disrupting the sand or scape too much. I'm not using any fancy water, and it's just regular tap water that's been dechlorinated. To bring a bit more detail to the water's surface, I'm going to place in some floating plants. I think a couple different species varying in size and texture always adds a more natural look. Now let's install the filter and get the waterfalls running before adding any moss. Right at the top of the intake, I'm adding a small amount of filter wool to help polish the water. It's working great, but as I said earlier, I want the water to flow down over the wood a bit more naturally. Adding moss is a super easy way to manipulate the flow of the water. I'm adding small patches of this Christmas moss around the output pipes, and as you can see, it drastically changes the flow. Before leaving the paladarium to grow in, I'm going to add some springtails. These tiny bugs will help keep the ecosystem clean and healthy by eating things like mold and decaying matter. Now all that's left to do is to close the hinged door and leave the paladarium to grow in and establish. It's been just under 3 months since I set this Nanopaladarium up, and I'm glad to say that it's thriving. To my surprise, all the plants are doing unbelievably well. I was half expecting to see some nutrient deficiencies by now, but as you can see, that's simply not the case. I definitely need to do a bit more experimentation with this substrate method, as these results are really quite promising. As for the waterfalls, they're both still flowing perfectly, and I really love watching these slow drips over on the left side. Now let's take a look under the water, as things are slightly different than I expected. As I'm sure you can tell, the water's got a bit of coloration to it. The reason for this coloration is simply because the bogwood is slowly leaching tannins into the water. I could fix it by simply doing more water changes or even adding some carbon to the filter, but to be honest, I really like how natural it makes the tank look. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you look closely, you might be able to see some life inhabiting the water. A couple weeks ago, I added a small group of tiny baby cherry shrimp. They're all doing really well, and despite their small size, they have grown significantly since I introduced them, which I'm guessing is due to the abundance of food. I doubt I'll keep them in here once they're fully grown, as it might be a bit small, but it's going to serve as a great grow out tank. As for the external filter, there's no issues to report whatsoever. It's still working just as it was on day one, but it might need a slight clean soon. Other than general maintenance such as cleaning the glass, I really haven't done too much at all. Believe it or not, I've only done 2 water changes in the past 80 days. I do think this has played a key role in the success of the paludarium as it's kept all the parameters nice and stable. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this build in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'll be making a waterfall terrarium inside this glass jar. This jar was made to be filled up with water and to use this tap here to fill up your drinks. I got this one purposefully as this feature is going to be really useful in building this waterfall terrarium. What I'm going to do first is turn the jar on its side and remove the tap. This is easy enough to do by hand, but some pliers will help out if you're struggling. Now the tap's removed, you can see the clean hole going straight through the glass. Now you could drill this hole yourself, but I think having the glass jar with the hole already in place is a lot less intimidating and a lot more beginner friendly. These are some silicone tubes and they're how the waterfall is going to be created. They'll hook up to a pump where it pulls water from the bottom of the jar and pushes it all the way to the top. It might look a bit confusing at the moment, but trust me, it's going to be pretty simple. This is the intake pipe that will pull the water from the bottom of the jar. I've made a mark for how much of the tube I want inside the jar, and now I need to make some holes in it so the water can be pulled in easily. The simplest way I've found of making these holes is by pinching the tube and then cutting it with some scissors. I'll repeat the same process until I've made a good amount of holes. I'm making sure only to cut them after the black line that I measured earlier. That'll be more than enough, so let's get it in place inside the jar. I'll secure it shortly, but let's first install the output pipe. This is even more simple as all I'm going to do is pull the tube through until it reaches the top of the jar. Now I'm going to use this aquarium silicone to seal up the hole to ensure that it's watertight and doesn't leak. I'm applying a generous amount and then using my finger to spread it out to ensure that there's no holes. I'm also going to place a few dots of silicone on the inside of the jar to attach the intake tube to the base. Over 24 hours have passed and the silicone is fully cured. I've water tested it off camera and there's no leaks whatsoever. The next thing I'm going to do is install a drainage layer at the base of the terrarium. I think the best choice for this build is going to be some coarse filter foam. If I was to use something like gravel, I'd have to put a guard on the silicone tubing as it will get sucked up by the pump. I placed the jar on top to get a rough idea of what size it needs to be, and now I'll cut it down with some scissors. This certainly doesn't need to be too precise, but having it slightly bigger than it needs to be is better than having it too small. The filter foam serves a few purposes. It will stop the substrate from getting down into the pump, help filter out the water, and also elevate the hardscape. Talking about hardscape, that's what I'm going to work on next. I'll build the waterfall using these dragon stones. What makes a build like this one difficult is the small opening in the jar, as it does restrict what you can fit inside. With that said, it's nothing a bit of patience and trial and error can't work around. I'm happy with the placement of these pieces, so I'm going to go ahead and join them together with some gel type superglue. Now they're locked together, I can go ahead and build the hardscape up even higher. All the dragonstone is inside and locked together, but I do still have to be careful as it is quite fragile and I don't want it falling into the glass. I'm really happy with how it's looking, so let's move on to the next step. This here is some expanding foam and I'm going to use it to fill in all the gaps behind the dragonstone. Filling in the area behind the waterfall is not only going to make it much stronger, but it'll also allow the water to flow down over the rocks like a proper waterfall. If I don't fill this area in, the water will simply trickle down the back of the stones and you won't be able to see it at all, which is not what we want. Whilst the expanding foam is still wet, I'm going to use some small pieces of dragonstone to plug in some of the larger holes. It's the next day and the expanded foam is fully cured. I can now tear off all the excess that's poking through the rocks. I've cleaned it up as best as I can, but there's still a lot of foam showing. Usually I'd cover this up with some super glue and crushed dragonstone. I think the small opening is going to make this really difficult, so I'm going to hide it with moss and plants later on. Before going any further, I want to test the waterfall, so let's get it ready to go. I've trimmed down the silicone tube, so let's now install the pump, or in this case the mini canister filter. I built this mini filter myself using a small plastic container, and I do have a tutorial on my channel if you want to learn how to make it. Inside is some filter foam, and I'm also going to add some fine filter floss which will help keep the water nice and clean. It's really not too hard to make and even easier to maintain. Having the pump on the outside of the jar opposed to having it inside the jar means I have much easier access to it if I ever need to replace it or clean it. Now I can add some water to the jar and prime the canister filter by pouring some water inside. With that done, let's turn on the pump and see how the waterfall flows. I'm really happy with it, and I think it's the perfect amount of flow for this jar. It's great to see the water flowing down over the dragonstone rocks just like I planned, and it's only going to look better with the addition of moss and plants. Changing the water inside the terrarium is going to be super easy, as all I've got to do is remove the top tube and siphon out the water. I'll be doing this every week or so. Now let's turn the waterfall back on and move on to the substrate. I think the ideal substrate for this build is going to be aqua soil. It's made for aquariums, so it's not going to have a problem with being constantly wet and having water flowing through it. My normal terrarium substrate would have a problem with this, and it's not suitable for this build. I've poured some in the foreground and evened it out, so now that's done, I think it's about time to start adding the moss. This here is Java moss. It's an easy to grow beginner species that's often used in aquariums. I think it will look great growing on the dragonstone rocks inside this setup. I'm mainly planting the moss in areas to cover up the expanding foam. One important thing to note is to make sure that the moss is in contact with the water flowing down from the waterfall. Only a very small amount needs to be in contact, as it will wick up the water on its own. Using the moss to wick the water also allows you to pull the water to the left and right side of the scape instead of it just being flowing down the centre. Next up, I've got some of this beautiful trident fern. This plant is an epiphyte, so all I've got to do is wedge it in gaps between the dragonstone. It will pull its nutrients from the water flowing through it. I really like this plant, and I think its deep green leaves really add a nice jungle feel to this terrarium. Before adding any plants to the base, I'm going to place in some of these dragonstone rocks to add a bit more detail. I think a carpeting plant will look really good growing at the base of the terrarium. I'll plant in a few patches of this Monte Carlo, which has some really nice small green leaves. It will spread and form a dense carpet in no time at all. As some of you may know, a lot of the plants in this setup are actually sold as aquarium plants. So long as the humidity is kept high, they'll also grow great in terrariums like this one. I've planted in a few patches of Leliopsis in the foreground to add some variety to the Monte Carlo. Next, I've got a few cuttings of Hygrophila. I really like the leaves on this plant, and also it's super easy to grow. I've planted some cuttings at the base as well as a few on the dragonstone waterfall. The last plants to go in is going to be some Anubias and Bucephalandra. These will add some nice detail in the gaps between the dragonstones. I'm going to add some springtails, which will help keep the terrarium clean and healthy by eating things like mould and decaying matter. All that's left to do now is to close up the jar and let this slice of nature grow in. Four weeks have passed, and I'm glad to say that this waterfall jar terrarium is thriving. All the plants have started to grow in really well, and there's only been a couple leaves die off here and there. It's great to see that the waterfall is still flowing just as well as it was on day one. The mini filter has done a great job so far, and I hope it stays that way. I've cut the tube slightly shorter so it can sit right behind the jar and you don't even realise it's there. In terms of the plants, the highlight for me has got to be the stunning new growth from the Hygrophila and the lush Monte Carlo carpet. There's still a few gaps that it needs to fill in, but it's certainly on its way. I really enjoyed making this terrarium, and it's been a joy to watch it grow in over the past 4 weeks. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, as I've got some really cool builds coming in the near future and I wouldn't want you to miss them. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a jungle terrarium that has 2 flowing waterfalls. I'm going to start by building the glass tank. To buy a small custom-made glass tank like this, it will usually set you back a decent amount of money. I'm going to show you a low-budget, easy way to make it yourself. I got these frameless picture frames for a few pounds each. They're a great way to get hold of some low cost glass. The glass from these is 2mm, try to avoid going any thinner. To cut the glass you'll need a glass cutter, a ruler and a Sharpie. I start by taking the ruler and marking out the length I want to cut. Make sure you do this at both ends. Then I take some tape, attach it to the ruler, line the ruler up and attach it onto the glass. The tape will help keep the ruler in place and stop it from moving about whilst you're cutting the glass. Next I take the glass cutter and do one continuous score on the glass. Then it's as easy as pulling the ruler off, taking the glass to a straight edge and giving it a few gentle taps. You should be left with a straight, clean break. It may seem complicated at first, but it's definitely not as hard as you might think. Just get a few cheap frames and start practicing. You're bound to mess up here and there, but you'll be surprised at how easy it is. Once I've cut out all the pieces, I like to use some electrical tape to do a test fit. I do this before sanding the glass down just to make sure everything's the right size. Keep in mind that the glass is very sharp at this point, so handle it with care. Everything fit together perfectly, so it's time to sand down the sharp edges. One bonus of using glass from picture frames is that most of the edges are actually already smooth, so you haven't got to do that much sanding. Only the edges that you cut will need to be sanded down. When sanding glass, make sure that the sandpaper and glass is wet. This will eliminate glass dust, which is something you definitely don't want to be breathing in. Once all the pieces were sanded and dried, I placed on a few bits of electrical tape. This will hold the pieces together whilst the silicone dries. With that done, it's now time for the silicone. As you can see, the opening for the silicone to come out is quite large. I'm going to use some tape to make it a little bit narrower. This will help create a thinner bead of silicone, which is ideal for the tank size I'm building. Now I'm going to start placing the silicone on the glass. At this point it's important to work fast, but doing your best not to rush. Typically you've got about 10 to 15 minutes before the silicone starts to cure. I should mention that you should only use 100% silicone or silicone that's advertised as aquarium or fish safe. I'm carefully placing each piece in its correct location and gently pressing it down into place. At this point I'm constantly checking if everything's square and in line. With most of the pieces in and the tape secured, I go on to add another bead of silicone along the inside. I'm then going to use my finger to smoothen out the silicone and remove the excess. Adding the secondary bead of silicone helps ensure that the tank is watertight and it won't leak. I then attach the front panel and the top panel and leave the tank to dry for 24 hours. 24 hours later and the silicone has fully cured. Now I'm going to remove the electrical tape and start to clean up any imperfections. This is easily done with a sharp blade. It can be quite tempting to try and remove the imperfections whilst the silicone is still wet, but I speak from experience that it's much easier to wait till it's fully dried and then removing it. Here's how it looks after being cleaned up. It's definitely not the neatest, but I'm still happy with it. Now I'm going to move on to the drainage layer. For this I'm going to be using this black filter foam. It's very lightweight and will have the added benefit of filtering the water as it gets pulled into the pump. I cut a piece the size off camera and placed it inside the tank. Before continuing, I need to make sure that the tank holds water and it doesn't have any leaks. I'm going to fill the bottom section of the tank up and leave it for a few hours. I very rarely have a leaking tank, but it's always good to test. A good few hours have passed and the tank is all good, so it's time to move on. Now let's start talking about the scape I want to create. I want to create a large waterfall that flows down from the left and another smaller one on the right side. To make these, I'm primarily going to be using some expanding foam. I'm going to start by lining the inside of the tank with some cling film. This will serve as a barrier between the expanding foam and the glass. This will mean I can easily remove it once it's dried. After giving the bottle a good shake, I started to apply it inside the tank. I created a larger section on the left and a slightly smaller one on the right, and they both joined up in the middle. I then left it to dry for about 24 hours. 24 hours later, and as you can see, it's expanded quite a lot. At this point it's fully dried, so I'm going to try and remove it from the tank. This wasn't too hard at all and it did come out relatively easily. I can then remove the cling film, which made it much easier to get in and out of the tank. After placing it back inside, I can really start to see the vision I had for this build, with the large waterfall flowing down on the left and the smaller one on the right. Before I start carving the foam, I'm going to take a Sharpie and start marking out some of the paths that I want the water to flow down. I'm really glad I did this, as it gave me a great idea of how I want the water to flow down the scape. Next I started carving the foam. I started off by primarily focusing on the areas I want the water to flow down. These areas will need to be slightly deeper and will help determine the flow of the water. I did the majority of the carving by hand as it was very easy to just pull the foam out with my fingers. As you can see, it's really starting to take shape. Now that all the foam's been carved, I want to add a few pieces of lava rock throughout the waterfall. I'm adding these to add a little more depth and interest in certain areas. I placed in a few more and here's how it's looking. It doesn't exactly look too natural at the moment, but by the end you won't even be able to tell between the rocks and the foam. At the moment they're just wedged in place, so I'm going to secure them with the superglue and tissue method. All I do is wedge some tissue between the rock and the foam and soak it in superglue. It dries quickly and forms a strong bond which is 100% plant safe. With all the rocks in place and all the foam fully carved, it's time to move on. I'm using a long stick to poke through some holes which will serve as the outlet of the waterfalls. Now I'm going to use a sharp blade to trim off the back edges so the tubing of the pump can fit through. I'm just doing this very rough at the moment and I'll do it properly and in more detail once we get the pump in. Now I'm going to start covering up all the exposed foam. I'm going to do this using this crushed black lava rock. I'll attach it to the background with the same silicone I used to build the tank. As I explained at the start, make sure you're using the proper type of silicone. I cover a small patch in silicone and then use my finger to spread it out and get it in all the gaps and cracks. Then I'm taking the lava rock and pouring it on top. After pouring on a generous amount, I press it down into the silicone. This will help ensure it gets stuck in place. I then pour off the excess lava rock and here's how it looks. As you can see, there's a few gaps that I missed, but these can be easily covered as I go. I continue the same process and work in small chunks at a time. If you're too ambitious and place on too much silicone, it can start to dry before you get the lava rock on, which is definitely not what you want. Even with just half of it done, it's really starting to look how I wanted. Here's how it looks after I finished covering all the foam in black lava rock and left it to dry for 24 hours. As you can probably see, there's a few patches that I missed, which I'm going to show you now how to easily cover up. I'm simply going to take some superglue and place a small amount on the exposed foam. I can then take some more crushed black lava rock and sprinkle it on top. I then remove the excess and as you can see it covers it up really well. It also dries very quickly, so I haven't got to wait another 24 hours if I decided to cover it up using silicone. With the background pretty much done, I'm going to place it inside the tank to get a general idea of how it's going to look. It's really starting to come together and it's looking just how I hoped it would. Now it's time to move on and start installing the pump. I'm using this small USB brushless water pump. I did add a small 90-degree angle on the intake to ensure that it works in low water. In the end this wasn't actually necessary, but I did it just in case. I then took a sharp blade and cut out a section of the foam for the pump to sit in. I also made sure to cut out a section for the intake to sit into. The pump fits in nicely, so now it's time to move on to the outlet. To get the water from the pump up to the waterfalls, I'm using this 10mm tubing. I've already roughly cut them to size and joined two pieces together that would lead to both waterfalls. The tubing fits over the outlet of the pump perfectly. Now I'm once again going to take a sharp blade and start cutting away at the back of the background. I carved out a rough path which the tubes can fit into, whilst the background can still sit flush with the glass. Now I need to attach some more tubing which will lead to the output of the waterfalls. To do this, I took a sharp blade and carved out a hole in the tube. The smaller piece can then fit into the hole and be glued into place. I did cut out a small notch into the tube which will allow for a better flow of water. Then I'm simply going to use some super glue to glue them in place. Here's how they look after being glued into place, and they're very solid and won't be going anywhere. Before installing the pump, I want to add some spiderwood to the hardscape to add a little contrast and some interest. I only wanted to place a few branches, so I took some time to find the best location for each piece. Once I did, I secured it in place with the superglue and tissue method. Here's how it looks with all the spiderwood in place. I'm very happy with how it's looking, but the exposed glue needs to be covered up. This was easily done with more superglue and crushed lava rock. I'm also going to take a Sharpie and cover up all the foam on the edges. As you can see, it's visible in the side reflection and definitely doesn't look very natural. Once the ink's dry, it's inert, which means it's completely safe to use. If you're enjoying this build, drop it a like, and why not consider subscribing so you don't miss any future builds. Now when placing it inside the tank, you can see that yellow foam reflection is gone. Although I probably should have done this at the start, I'm going to take a small section of foam and cut it to size that will sit on the bottom of the tank. This will protect the glass from any uneven surfaces that the tank sits on. I'm using a black Sharpie to cover the front and sides so the blue doesn't stand out. I then took some double-sided tape and stuck it to the bottom of the tank. Now it's finally time to put the background, pump and tubing together and give it a test run. I filled the bottom up with water until the intake was fully submerged and then plugged in the USB cable. Both halves of the waterfall worked great, but a little more powerful than I expected. I'll show you how I went about fixing that later on. With the test run complete and successful, I'm going to assemble the tank for the final time. The USB cable for the pump runs at the back of the tank and fits through a small hole at the top. I completely forgot to mention, but I did cover up the holes on the top of the tubing on either side of the waterfall. With everything in place, it's now finally time to get in the substrate. I'm going to use aquasoil as it's got no problem being wet and having water running through it. My regular terrarium substrate will not be suitable for this build. I pour in a generous amount and then gently spread it out with my fingers. To add some more interest and a better transition up to the background, I'm going to add a few pieces of lava rock to the bottom of the scape. I didn't go too overboard and only added a few bits. Now I'm going to start bringing this terrarium to life with plants. This is trident leaf Java fern. I'm going to wedge it in behind the background. I think it will look really good in the back and make it look as if there's a dense jungle growing behind the waterfalls. I used some long tweezers to wedge it down into place. In case you didn't know, this plant is an epiphyte and should not be planted into substrate. It's starting to look great already, but there's plenty more plants to come. This is a large species of Anubias that has some beautiful deep ridged leaves. I really think it will help bring a jungle feel into this waterfall terrarium. After removing the rock wall, I experimented with a few different locations before deciding where to place it. I removed some of the trident fern and placed it in the centre of the background. I made sure to keep the plants nice and damp by giving them a good spray every now and then. Next I'm going to plant this Anubias throughout the tank as well. This Anubias has got some beautiful arrow-shaped leaves and I think it will look great growing at the bottom of the tank. As this plant is an epiphyte, I made sure not to plant the rhizome into the substrate. I used some superglue to mount the larger section to a rock and then placed it at the base of the tank. This is perfectly safe to do, just try not to use too much superglue. I've got a few bits of Bucephalandra which I'm going to place throughout the waterfalls. These will grow really well in the flow of water. I've also got a few smaller pieces which will help bring a little more detail and interest throughout the terrarium. Here's how it looks with most of the plants in. I'm really happy with how it's coming together. I love how the base of the tank is looking and really think it's going to look like a true jungle terrarium. One thing I don't like is being able to see the outlets of the waterfalls. I'm going to use a small piece of black lava rock and some superglue to make it a little more secluded. This terrarium would definitely not be complete without some moss. For this build, I'm going to be using Java moss. Like all the other plants in here, it's an aquatic species which will have no trouble growing inside this setup. I tore off small chunks and placed them throughout the terrarium. The constant flow of water will keep the moss damp and saturated, promoting new growth. I'm hoping it will slowly grow and spread over the lava rock. I'm tearing off small chunks and placing them at the bottom of the tank. It will have no trouble growing at the base of the tank and will bring some colour to the black lava rock and substrate. I'm loving how the terrarium's looking with all the moss and plants in, but it's not done yet. Before moving on, I'm going to give all the moss and plants a good spray down to ensure they're not drying out. Now I'm going to introduce some life. As you may already know, these are springtails. They'll help keep the terrarium clean by eating mould and decaying matter. Their population will self-regulate depending on available food, so you've never got to worry about them overpopulating the tank. You can get a good sense of just how small they are on this Anubias leaf. Now it's time to fill up the base of the terrarium with water. I did this very slowly to try not to disturb the plants and moss in the bottom of the scape. It doesn't need to be filled to the top, just make sure the intake of the pump is fully submerged. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch on the pump. Similar to the test run earlier, the output on the left was a little too strong. This was a simple and easy fix by placing a tiny bit of filter foam just in front of the output. This helped the water flow down instead of being pushed straight out. The waterfall's flow was perfect and I loved how it looked going through the moss and plants. Of course, this terrarium needs a front panel to trap the humidity inside. This was easily done with a piece of glass that's held on with some tape that acts as a hinge. I then left the terrarium to grow for 4 weeks. 4 weeks later and the jungle waterfall terrarium is thriving. I'm going to take the front panel off to get a better look inside. Both waterfalls are still flowing perfectly and all the moss and plants inside have been growing great. The moss is growing just how I hoped it would, and the plants have been filling out nicely, which is helping to bring out that jungle look I was going for. Do you think there's anything else I can do to make it look even more like a jungle? I was thinking of maybe adding some twisted vines. Let me know in the comments below. A couple weeks in, the spiderwood did go for a slight mould phase, which was completely expected. Fast forward to today and it's pretty much all cleaned up thanks to the springtails. Most of the plants have got some new growth, as can be seen in this stunning Anubias leaf. The Anubias and Bucephalandra planted on the waterfall have shot out these new roots, which I think help add to the detail of the scape. All the moss growing at the base and throughout the waterfalls has been growing really well and is in need of a trim sometime soon. Overall, I'm extremely happy with how this waterfall terrarium turned out. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this build and want to see more like it. Thanks for watching, and why not check out this video, as I think you might enjoy it too. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this amazing dragonstone waterfall ecosystem. A few weeks ago, I found this plastic container in a shop and I knew that I had to make something with it. It's got a base that spins, so here's my idea. I want to create a rock structure in the centre that can be viewed from 360 degrees. I also want to add a pump at the bottom so it have water flowing down over it. To start off, I'm going to cut some coarse filter foam to size that will sit at the bottom of the container. This will act as the drainage layer and allow water to freely pass through it into the intake of the pump. I'm using a sharp blade to roughly mark out the shape and then using some scissors to cut it out. As you can see, it fits nice and snug into the plastic container. The next thing to do is to start working on the hardscape. I've got a decent sized piece of dragonstone which I'm going to be using. Now you can clearly see the rough idea that I'm going for. As it is, I do think it's a little bit too big and I'd have a lot of trouble creating a hole down the centre for the outlet of the pump. So what I'm going to do is use a hammer to break the dragonstone up into multiple pieces which I can use to build a structure. The stones are extremely dusty and dirty, so before building I'm going to give them a good rinse down. Whilst the dragonstone dries off, I'm going to get to work installing the pump. I've got this small USB aquarium pump which should be perfect for what I've got in mind. I'll leave a link to this one in the description, plus all the other materials and plants that I'll be using for this build. With the pump installed, I now need to work on the outlet which will get the water to the top of the dragonstone. I'm starting off by attaching a small piece of tubing to the outlet with some super glue. I'm then attaching it back on the pump and placing on some more tubing which fits nice and snug. It will need some more work towards the top later, but for now I can start working on the hardscape. As you can see, I ended up with a fair few pieces from that single large rock. Before building, I cut some leftover filter foam to size to sit on top of the pump. This should stop things like substrate and rocks from getting down into the intake. With that done, I can finally start building. I'm placing in the dragonstone to surround the tubing and then using the super glue and tissue method to secure them together once I'm happy. I'm simply wedging some tissue between the contact points and then soaking it in super glue. I'm making sure to lock the rocks together in multiple locations to ensure that they don't break apart. It dries in no time at all and the result is a strong bond which is 100% plant safe. Now I'm going to continue building up and around the tubing. One thing that's always hard to get across with video is how long and how much trial and error it takes to build some scapes. It can look like I just throw the pieces on and glue them in place, but that's simply not the case. What I like to do is take some time and experiment with multiple different layouts and structures before I glue anything down. This could be 10 minutes, an hour, or even in some cases a few days. Although you certainly don't have to spend days hardscaping your build, the point I'm trying to make is that once the ecosystem is complete, it's really hard to make any changes, so it's a good idea to come up with something you're happy with right from the start. Here's the main hardscape for this build complete, and I've got to say I'm really happy with how it's looking. However, there is a big problem as it's got a bunch of holes in it, meaning the water won't flow down over the rocks. An easy solution to this is to fill in all the gaps with some expanding foam. This will not only ensure that the water flows down over the dragonstone properly, but it will also help strengthen the entire structure. This stuff does expand a lot, so try not to apply too much. A couple hours have passed and it's fully cured, and as you can probably see, I once again applied too much. This isn't a problem as it's super easy to tear off anyway. Here's how it looks with all the foam carved down. It doesn't look the best at the moment, but I'll be covering it up later on. Before doing that, I'm going to go back to working on the output of the water feature. I'm going to heat up the end of this screwdriver and poke several holes through the tubing. I'm hoping the water will slowly trickle out and down over the dragonstones. With the holes done, I'm now going to take some scissors and cut off the excess tubing off the top. I'm then applying a small amount of super glue and plugging up the top with some leftover filter foam. With the hole covered up, I'm now going to use some more dragonstone to help hide everything. The important thing here is not blocking up the output or the path of the water. As you can see, I managed to leave some reasonable sized gaps where the water can flow out and down. The next thing to do is to start covering up the not so nice looking expanding foam. To make this as easy as possible, I'm going to remove the entire structure from the container and take off the pump. Here I've got some liquid superglue and some crushed dragonstone that I got from breaking up the rocks earlier. All I'm doing is applying some superglue onto the foam that I want to cover up and then sprinkling on some of the crushed dragonstone. After gently pressing it in, I can brush off the excess, and as you can see, it covers up the foam really nicely. This is a super easy and simple way of creating a seamless joint between the rocks. I absolutely love how it's looking with all the foam covered up, but before moving on, I'm going to give it a quick spray down as it's really quite dusty. With the dragonstone nice and clean, I can reinstall the pump and place the hardscape back inside the container. You might notice that there are a few places where you can still see the foam, but this isn't a problem as it will be easy to cover later with some moss and plants. Before going any further, I think it's about time to do a water test on the pump and see how it flows. It went everywhere and I'm not sure why I didn't see it coming, but it was an easy fix by loosely placing some coarse filter foam inside the gaps. Now when turning the pump on, instead of spraying water everywhere, it flows nice and smoothly down over the dragonstone. With the water test complete and successful, I'm going to turn the pump off and siphon out the water. Now it's time to get the substrate in. In my opinion, the ideal substrate for this build is aquasoil. It doesn't mind being saturated and having water constantly flowing through it. It'll also provide a good amount of nutrients for the plants I'm going to use later. Now the substrate is in, I'm going to place in some small pieces of dragonstone at the base of the scape to add some more detail. These should hopefully look like pieces that have fallen off the main rock structure, and it also helps create a smoother transition from the aquasoil up to the large dragonstone. Before getting the plants in, I do want to add a little more detail with some spiderwood branches. I don't know about you, but I always find that adding small branches like these is a great way of improving the detail of any scape. As you can probably have guessed, I made sure to secure them down onto the rocks. With the hardscape complete, I'm now going to fill the container up and turn the pump on before getting planting. Now it's finally time to start getting the plants in. This is a tub of Monte Carlo trimmings that I got from my nano aquarium. I'm going to plant them on top of the aquasoil throughout the scape. With time, I'm hoping it's going to form a dense lush carpet and you won't be able to see the aquasoil at all. Just to be clear, this is an aquatic plant that also grows great immersed in terrariums. However, I've never actually tried growing it in the open air like this, so this project is going to be a bit of an experiment. I'm thinking that as the substrate is going to be constantly damp, the Monte Carlo should never dry out. I think some plants growing on the dragonstone will look great, so I'm going to do that next. This here is a tub of Bucephalandra. Before using it, I'm going to take it out the tub and rinse out the nutrient-rich gel that it's grown in. Now I'm just separating the plants into smaller sections and then I'm going to start placing them on the dragonstone. This plant is an epiphyte, so it doesn't actually need the substrate to grow. It will simply pull nutrients from the water flowing through it. Similar to the Monte Carlo, I'm not completely sure how this plant's going to do out in the open air, but there's only one way to find out. This build is definitely in need of some moss, so let's plant that next. This here is some Christmas moss. It's a relatively slow growing species of moss that likes to stay compact instead of growing leggy. All I'm going to do is tear off small chunks and then place it in locations where it's in contact with the water. I'm also going to use it to cover up the black filter foam. Luckily, I'm not needing to use anything to attach this moss in place. The texture of the dragonstone is simply enough to hold it in place and stop it flowing down the rocks. In no time at all, it will latch itself to the stone and start to spread. I think it will look better with some contrast throughout the Monte Carlo carpet, so I'm going to plant some of this Liliopsis. I'm pulling out the small runners and then planting them down into the aquasoil. I'm really liking the variety of leaf shape and texture that they bring to the bottom of the scape. With the planting complete, all that's left to do is to let it grow in. I'm hoping that all the plants will establish nicely. Six weeks have passed and I'm glad to say that this waterfall ecosystem is thriving. Just as I'd hoped, the Monte Carlo carpet has completely filled out the bottom of the scape. As I said when I planted it, it was a bit of an experiment and I wasn't sure how it was going to grow, so it's great to see how well it's done. This definitely opens the door for more scapes in the open air like this. It's not just the Monte Carlo that's done well, as the Leliopsis has also started to establish really nicely. Also, to my surprise, the Bucephalandra on the Dragonstone is still growing strong. There is the odd leaf that has dried out and died, but all the new ones that are coming through look super healthy. The Christmas moss, which I expected to thrive, is the only one not doing so well. A few of the patches have gone brown and died, and I'm not completely sure why. With that said, it is growing well and spreading in other locations. The only downside to a setup like this is that I do have to top it up every few days, as the water evaporates really quite fast. Overall, I'm extremely happy with how this setup's turned out, and it really does make a great display piece. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this build and want to see more like it. As always, be sure to subscribe and thank you for watching. In this video, I'm going to turn this glass box into a paludarium ecosystem that has not one, not two, but 3 flowing waterfalls. Be sure to stick around to the end, as I'm even going to add some tiny inhabitants. Let's get straight into the build, it's going to be a good one. For this build, I'm using this tank that has a nice tapered open section. I really want to create a scape that utilises its unique shape. To get started, I'm going to place in some coarse filter foam at the base. I do want the water in this paludarium to be relatively deep, so I'm going to place in 2 layers. Obviously, to have an open area of water like a true paludarium, I'm going to need to start cutting out the foam. It's easy enough to do with some scissors. This is where you can get creative and come up with a unique shaped water area for your tank. With that said, I am actually keeping it pretty simple for this build. That should be enough room for the water, so now I'm going to move on to my favourite part, which is creating the hardscape. I'm going to start by lining the inside of the tank with some cling film. Don't worry, you'll understand why I'm doing this shortly. This does look like a really strange way to start the hardscape, but trust me, it'll make sense soon. Now I'm going to take some expanding foam and apply it inside. The cling film will stop it attaching to the glass or the filter foam, so I can remove it later. I'm doing one pass over, then letting it completely dry and then repeating. Here it is the next day with the foam fully cured. It really doesn't look the best right now, but I'm going to start carving it out shortly. As you can see, the entire piece of foam really does come out nice and easy, and it leaves the tank completely intact. Now I'm going to slide it back in and start carving. You can use something like a knife, but I find it easier just to pull out the chunks with my hands. Before going any further, I'm going to take a marker pen and create a quick plan. I want to have a small water stream on the right with a larger waterfall in the centre and another small stream on the left. Creating a rough plan makes it a lot easier when carving, as it gives you a general shape to follow. It's going well so far, but there are a few cavities inside the foam that I want to fill in before going any further. I'm also going to take this opportunity to change up the shape slightly so the larger waterfall is slightly further back. Obviously, I made sure to place in some more cling film to stop the foam sticking. Here's how the hardscape's looking with it being fully dried and carved out. I'm really liking it so far, and you can clearly see the 3 water features that I'm going for. Now let's get to work installing the pump. This is a small brushless aquarium pump that should be able to handle all 3 outputs. To install it, I'm simply measuring and cutting out a section in the foam for it to sit into. Now let's talk about the output. This is a piece of tubing that I've modified to go from 1 to 3 ways. It's certainly not the neatest, but hopefully it'll do the job. For the left and right, I'm going to screw in some of these push connectors that I had lying around. To be honest, it would have been easier just to buy a 4-way connector, but it's pretty much finished now anyway. Now I'm going to place on some 90-degree corners and then push in some 6mm tubing. The thinner tubes would be for the small streams on the left and right, and the thicker tube would be for the waterfall down the centre. The different diameter of the tubing should naturally mean that most of the water goes up through the centre for the large waterfall. Now I'm going to start creating the holes in the foam where the water is going to flow down. I used a wooden skewer just to make a guide hole and then widened them out with some 6mm tubing. Now I'm going to carve out the foam so it sits nice and flush with the back of the tank when the outputs are in place. For the output of the two small streams, I'm going to utilise these 90-degree connectors. I'm using some super glue to attach them in place and stop them from falling out. With them securely in place, I can now push them into the 6mm tubing coming out from the pump. This is about as neat as I can get it, and to be honest, I don't think it's too bad at all. Now let's move back to the hardscape. Before covering up the expanded foam, I want to place in a few pieces of lava rock to add a little bit more detail. I'm experimenting with different pieces in different places, and then once I'm happy, I'm going to lock them in place with the super glue and tissue method. I'm placing some tissue in between the foam and the lava rock and then soaking it in super glue. It creates a strong bond and it dries in no time. You're probably thinking that this scape looks absolutely ridiculous at the moment, and you're probably right, so let's fix that now. I'm now going to work on covering up the expanded foam, and by the time I'm done, you'll hardly be able to tell between the real rocks and the fake ones. To cover up the foam, I'm going to use some crushed lava rock and some black aquarium silicone. Firstly, I'm applying the silicone onto a small area of the foam. I'm then going to use my finger to spread it out and try and get it in all the gaps and cracks that I can. Now I'm taking the crushed lava rock, pouring it on top and then pressing it down into place. I can then remove the excess, and as you can see, it really does cover up the foam well and look quite natural. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process in small patches until everything's covered. I absolutely love how it looks with all the foam covered up, and you can see what I mean when I said that it's hard to tell the difference between the fake and the real rocks. When using this method to cover up the foam, there's always going to be a few patches that are missed. Instead of using more silicone and having to wait 24 hours for it to dry again, it's much easier just to use a small amount of super glue. Before going any further, I'm going to give the entire piece a really good spray down. Now it's nice and clean, I'm going to install the pump and place back in the hardscape. At this point, I'm also connecting the tube into the 90-degree push fittings. I should have done this at the start, but before going any further, I'm going to place on this foam mat to the base of the tank. This will help disperse the weight of the tank and protect it against uneven surfaces. It's easy enough to attach with some double-sided tape. Now it's time to fill up the tank and give the pump a quick test run to see how it flows. The water was bouncing down at first, but once everything got saturated, it flowed really nicely. I have also placed in a few pieces of black filter foam to stop the water coming out so aggressively. I'm really happy with how all three water features are flowing, and it's amazing to see my vision finally starting to take shape. Before pouring the sand in the foreground, I'm taking some leftover filter foam, tearing it into small pieces and wedging it under the hardscape. This should stop the sand travelling back towards the pump, which may lead to issues in the future. I'm using this fairly light coloured sand as I like the contrast it has with the black lava rock. I'm now going to place in some small rocks to create a smoother transition from the sand up to the black lava rocks. They'll also add some nice detail to the foreground. Now it's time to get the paladarium filled up with water. I'm placing in a small piece of paper towel to stop the water from disrupting the scape too much. Before getting any plants in, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the pump. To kick off the planting, I'm going to start with these asparagus ferns. I absolutely love this plant as they really do resemble miniature trees. Rightfully so, you're probably wondering how these plants are going to grow without any substrate. I'm planting them in locations where their roots will be in constant contact with the flowing water. This means they'll pull their nutrients from the water that flows down through the scape. I've done this before and it's worked great, so hopefully that'll be the case for this build too. In some locations, I'm making small holes which I can plant into. When doing this, it's important to create small drainage holes with something like a toothpick that will keep the water running through. I can then take the fern and plant the roots inside. I absolutely love how this tank is looking with all the ferns in, and it really does look like a miniature slice of nature. Next up is the moss. This here is a tub of weeping moss that I propagated myself. I have got a video on moss propagation on the channel if you wanted to learn how to grow it yourself. I'm planting the moss in the flow of the water, and I'm also using it to hide the roots of the ferns. Weeping moss is a relatively fast growing species that likes to grow low and compact. It should start spreading and growing over the hardscape in no time. Next up, I've got some plants that should add a little bit more detail and interest throughout the paladarium. The first one going in is a few cuttings of hydrocotyle. This fast growing plant will vine and creep all over the hardscape. After adding some floating plants into the water, I'm also going to plant a few cuttings of oak leaf creeping fig. This is one of my favourite plants and I think its small leaves will add some really nice detail to the scape. I made sure to choose some cuttings that already had some roots growing, as this will give the plant a nice head start in this setup. I'm absolutely loving how this paladarium's looking on day 1, but let's fast forward 8 weeks and see how it's holding up. Two months have passed and I'm glad to say that the paladarium is thriving. Before adding the tiny inhabitants into the water, let me tell you about some of the changes and additions that I've made. The first change I made is that I decided to paint the sides of the tank black. I think it looks a lot better and cleaner than being able to see the expanded foam through the glass. Another change which is not so obvious is that I've added a few more different species of plants. This here is Peperomia verticulata. It's an easy to grow plant which has these beautiful dark green leaves. I felt like this ecosystem was missing a pop of colour, but this Photonia solved that problem easily. The last plant I added is Sampelia glauca. I think it contributes nicely to the variety of leaf shape and textures throughout the tank. As for the plants that have been in here from the start, I'm glad to say that they're all doing great. The hydrocotta has started to vine and creep out, which is exactly what I wanted, and the oak leaf creeping fig has also started to grow nicely. The asparagus ferns, which have got to be the highlight of the tank, are doing great. Pretty much all of them have sent out new growth and I'm absolutely loving how they look. I did feel like the all black hardscape needed some contrast, so that's why I added the spiderwood. Now before adding the tiny creatures, I'm going to quickly show you how simple and easy it is to take this scape to the next level. These are some small spiderwood branches and I'm simply just going to place them throughout the scape. These small twigs resemble vines and roots and I really think they greatly improve the detail inside this tank. I want to know what you think. Would you have added these or would you have left the paladarium as it was? Let me know in the comments. Now without further ado, let's get the inhabitants inside. These here are some tiny aquatic snails and I think they'll be perfect for the water section of this paladarium. They'll stay small but they will get slightly bigger than this. These tiny snails will feed on things like algae that grows on the rocks, glass and sand. As you can see, they don't waste any time and get straight to work. All in all, I'm extremely happy with how this waterfall paladarium has turned out and I can't wait to continue watching it growing and evolving like a true miniature ecosystem. Be sure to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it and why not subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or updates. As always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a thriving paladarium that even has a working waterfall. Be sure to stick around to the end as I'll even be adding some tiny inhabitants. Let's get straight into the build, starting with making the tank. I've got a few of these frameless picture frames. I'm going to take them apart and use the glass to build the tank. Using glass from picture frames is a super easy and cost-effective way of building small tanks. I got these frames for a couple pounds each, but you can get them even cheaper from second-hand shops. Now let's get started with the glass cutting. A lot of people think that cutting glass is extremely complicated and hard to do, but I'm here to tell you it's not. With the right tools and a bit of practice, it really is quite simple. The main materials you'll need is a ruler, a marker pen and a glass cutter. I'll leave links to all the materials I'll be using for this build in the description below. As you've seen, I've already taken some measurements of where I want to cut this piece. A quick tip before cutting is to place on a few bits of sticky tack to the underside of the ruler. This will stop it from slipping around and ensure that you get a nice straight cut. Now I'm taking the glass cutter and scoring a line down the glass. Make sure you're pushing down firmly with one continuous take. It should sound like some paper being torn in half. Now the glass has been scored, I'm going to take it to a straight edge and give it a few gentle taps. As you can see, it snaps in half with ease. Once the glass is cut, make sure you handle it with care as the edges are extremely sharp. Cutting glass really isn't as difficult as you might think. Just get hold of some old picture frames and start practicing. You're bound to go wrong at first, but with a bit of practice, it really is quite easy. Now that all the glass has been cut, I like to do a quick test fit before sanding it down. I've made the mistake too many times of sanding the glass down only to find out that I've gone wrong. I'm simply using some electrical tape to hold all the pieces together. Make sure you're really careful with the glass at this point as it is super sharp. It's lucky I did this as I completely forgot to trim off a piece of the top where the wire for the pump will come out the tank. I took some measurements from the USB plug and then cut a section off accordingly. For small cuts like this, pliers come in handy. With that done, it's time to move on to the sanding. The factory edge on these picture frames is already super smooth, so I only need to sand the edges that I cut. When sanding glass, make sure that the sandpaper is wet. This stops any glass dust, which is something you definitely don't want to be breathing in. Now that all the glass is prepared, it's time to move on to assembling the tank with silicone. A quick tip to make applying the silicone easier is to add a bit of tape on the top. This makes the opening for the nozzle much smaller, which is more appropriate for the glass I'm using. As a good rule of thumb, the bead of silicone should be no thinner than the thickness of the glass. In this case, that's 2mm. Now the silicone has been applied, it's time to start assembling. You've got about 10 to 15 minutes before the silicone starts to cure, so it's important to work fast while still taking the time to make sure everything's in the right place and square. I'm assembling the tank piece by piece and then using the electrical tape to lock it in place. With the back and sides in place, I'm adding a secondary bead of silicone where the pieces meet. I'm then using my finger to smoothen it out and remove any excess silicone. Adding this secondary bead helps ensure that there will be no leaks. All that's left is the top and the front panel, and then the tank can be left to dry. I'll be attaching the door at the end. 24 hours later and the silicone is fully cured and ready to be cleaned up, but before doing so all the tape needs to be removed. The benefit of using electrical tape is that it leaves no residue on the glass. Now I'm taking a sharp blade and removing all the excess silicone around the outside of the tank. Technically you don't have to do this, but it will make the tank look much neater and more professional. Plus it really is quite satisfying. Now all the edges have been cleaned up, it's time for an essential step, which is testing for leaks. The tanks I've made very rarely have a leak, but it's always better to test now than find out there's a leak once the paludarium is complete. A few hours have passed and there's no leaks, so it's finally time to start building the paludarium. I'm going to start with the drainage layer, and for that I'm using some coarse filter foam. It's extremely light and easy to cut. It will also have the added benefit of filtering the water as it gets pulled into the pump. Now I'm taking some scissors and cutting off pieces of the foam. I want there to be a nice big open section of water, so I'm shaping the foam accordingly. At this stage you're free to shape the foam any way you want to make the water section bigger or smaller. Now I'm happy with the shape, it's time to move on to the hardscape. For this paludarium I'm choosing to use some maple leaf rocks. These pieces are certainly too big for this size tank, so let's fix that. I'm taking them outside and giving them some hits with a hammer to break them up into smaller pieces. Make sure you wear some kind of eye protection, as some pieces do go flying. As for all the dust and small rocks, I'm collecting them up as they'll come in handy later. Now the maple leaf rocks are a more appropriate size, it's time to start building. I'm starting by placing in the rocks one by one around the foam to create a retaining wall. As always, it does take a lot of experimenting with different pieces. I'm happy with these pieces so far, so I'm going to lock them together with the superglue and tissue method. I'm simply taking a small piece of tissue and placing it between the two rocks. I'm then soaking it in superglue and leaving it to dry for a couple minutes. The result is a strong bond which is 100% safe for live plants and animals. I'm continuing to add more rocks and gluing them together as I go. As you can see, the retaining wall part of the hardscape is pretty much complete, so now I'm going to start building up some height for the waterfall. Here's how it looks with all the rocks joined together. I'm really liking how it's looking, but I need to do a few things to make sure that the waterfall is functional and actually flows properly. Firstly, what I'm going to do is take some of the leftover filter foam from earlier and plug in any large holes. You'll see why I'm doing this shortly. Now all the holes on the hardscape have been filled in, I'm going to flip the piece over and start adding some expanding foam. After giving the bottle a good shake, I'm applying the foam all along the backside of the waterfall. If I didn't add the foam and left it as it is, all the water would fall down through all the gaps and cracks between the rocks. By adding the foam, it'll ensure that the water flows properly down over the rocks into the water area. Try not to add too much foam, as it really does expand quite a lot. About 10 minutes have passed and the foam is still wet inside but dry to the touch. What I'm doing now is pushing the foam down and compressing it into place. This is super easy to do at the moment, as the foam is still really soft and it'll mean I won't have to do any carving later on. After leaving the expanding foam for about an hour or so, it's pretty much fully dried and the filter foam from the front can now be removed. If I didn't plug these holes, the foam would have expanded through, which is certainly not ideal. With the filter foam removed from the front, I'm now going to start covering up all the marks from the expanding foam and the glue. To cover these up, I'm going to use some more super glue and the crushed rocks that I saved earlier. I'm simply applying the super glue to the area I want to cover up and then sprinkling the powdered rock on top. The excess can then be removed, and as you can see, it creates a nice seamless joint between the rocks. After covering up all the glue marks, I gave the entire piece a good wash down. Before going any further, I'm going to start installing the pump. I'm using this small USB aquarium pump for this build. Firstly, I'm taking off the output and gluing on a small piece of tubing to make it slightly wider. I can then reattach it and start measuring and cutting out a square in the foam whilst it dries. The pump fits nicely inside, so now I'm going to work on the output tubing. I'm attaching it in place and then placing the hardscape back inside the tank. I'm then using a Sharpie to mark where I want the water to come out from. Now I'm going to make a hole in the output for this tubing to fit into. The tubing can then go in and get secured in place with some glue. Once dry, it's nice and sturdy and can be installed back onto the pump. Now I'm placing the hardscape back inside and using some more maple leaf rocks to try and hide the output. It doesn't have to be completely hidden, as the moss and plants will do the majority of the work later on. Next, I'm taking a Sharpie and marking for where I want to cut the tubing. Now it's cut down, all I've got to do is plug the hole in the top. Now the hole's plugged, the output can go back onto the pump ready for a water test. It's always a good idea to do a test of the pump quite early on to see if you need to make any adjustments. In this case, the flow was a bit strong, but luckily the pump I'm using has an adjustable flow, so I turned it down a bit and it was much better. It flows just how I hoped it would, with the pump being pretty much silent, which is great. With the test done and successful, I'm going to go ahead and drain out the water. I should have done this at the start, but before moving on any further, I'm going to install this foam mat to the bottom of the tank. This will help protect the tank against uneven surfaces, putting unwanted stress on the glass. To attach it, I simply use some double-sided tape. With that done, I'm going to get the pump back in and feed the wire through the hole that I made at the start. I'm then going to add some filter foam on top, which will stop the substrate from getting into the intake. The hardscape structure can then go back in for the final time. As it is, I definitely think the hardscape's missing something, so I'm going to add some pieces of driftwood. I'm hoping these will create a nice contrast to the maple leaf rocks. When hardscaping, be sure to experiment with multiple different layouts until you find something you're happy with. After all, once the paladarium's complete, it will be really hard to make any changes. If you're enjoying this build so far or finding it useful, be sure to drop it a like. I'm really happy with this layout, and I love the way the wood flows and fits with the rocks. They're just balancing at the moment, so as you could probably have guessed, I'm going to secure them in place with the super glue and tissue method. Securing the hardscape in a tank like this is essential, as any small knocks and bumps would knock it over, making maintenance a nightmare. I don't know about you, but I think the hardscape looks 10 times better with the addition of the driftwood. I'm not going to worry about covering these glue marks, as that will be easy to do with moss and plants later. Now I'm taking some leftover filter foam and plugging any holes throughout the retaining wall. Plugging these holes will stop the substrate from falling down into the water area. Talking about substrate, for this build I'm using some aquasoil. Aquasoil is perfect for a paladarium build like this one, as it doesn't mind being on the wetter side with water constantly passing through it. I'm pouring in a generous amount into the background, with it sloping up towards the waterfall. With the substrate in, I'm going to finish off the hardscape by adding some sand into the open water area. I've chose a fairly light coloured sand, as I think it suits well with the maple leaf rocks. After pouring it in and spreading it out with a paintbrush, I'm going to add some small maple leaf rocks to create a more natural transition. These are once again leftover pieces from when I broke up the rocks earlier. I really love the detail they bring to the scape. Now before moving on and getting the plants in, I'm going to give the entire tank a good spray down. Now it's finally time to start bringing the paladarium to life with plants. I've got a variety of plants that all range in different leaf size, shape and colour, but one thing they've all got in common is that they're aquatic plants. Although they're often intended to grow underwater, they do grow really well out of water in setups like this. This is known as immersed growth, and actually the majority of aquarium plants are grown and sold in their immersed state. This is extremely useful for me, as they won't have to go through any acclimation or adjustments and they'll get straight to growing. I'm going to start by planting the majority of this trident fern behind the waterfall to hide the wire and the output of the pump. Like most of the plants I'm using in this setup, this plant is an epiphyte and should not be planted into the substrate. All I'm doing is wedging it in place behind the rocks. Next up is this beautiful Anubias, which has got to be one of my favourite plants. I want this plant at the base of the driftwood and for it to be a centrepiece of the paludarium. Next I've got another Anubias species that has some nice arrowhead shaped leaves. I'm planting it towards the back by simply wedging it in between some rocks. I'm then taking a smaller plant of the same species and planting it on the left side. It's very important not to let these plants dry out, so I'm giving them a light spray every now and then. Next I've got a good number of hygrophila cuttings which will be planted into the background. I love the shape of this plant's leaves and really think it helps bring out a deep jungle look. This is one of the few plants I'm using in this setup which can actually be planted into the substrate. You may have noticed that these cuttings have little to no roots at the moment, but that's not a problem as they'll root themselves in no time at all. Now it's time for some plants that will really bring out some detail and take this paludarium to another level. I've got a variety of different Bucephalandra species which I'm going to plant throughout the tank. These plants are slow growers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as it will mean they need much less maintenance than faster growing plants. I should mention that I'll have links to all the plants I've used in the description below. With most of the plants in, I'm really loving how this paludarium's looking, but there's still a few more to come. This here is Monte Carlo. It's a carpeting plant with small round leaves and I think it would be a nice addition to this tank. I'm splitting it up into smaller chunks and then using some long tweezers to plant it throughout the tank. It should stay nice and low and I'm hoping it will slowly creep over the rocks. No paludarium would be complete without some moss. This here is weeping moss. Before planting it, I'm using some scissors to trim it up into small pieces. By trimming it up, it will not only stimulate new growth, but it'll also mean you can cover more of the tank with less moss and ultimately save you some money. I'm making sure to use the moss to cover the output of the pump whilst not blocking the tubing at all. Now it's finally time to fill up the paludarium with water. A small square of paper towel will stop the water from disrupting the sand and the small rocks. Now the paludarium's full with water, I'm going to place in some floating plants. I really love the detail and interest these plants bring to the surface of the water. Now it's time to add some tiny bugs which will help keep this paludarium clean, healthy and thriving. As you probably guessed, I'm talking about springtails. These tiny bugs will eat things like mould and decaying matter throughout the tank and poop it out in the form of fertiliser for the plants. They are even more important in a tank like this as I used a good amount of wood which is always prone to growing mould. Now before turning on the waterfall, I need to attach the door which will trap the humidity and stop the paludarium from drying out. I cut some glass to size and then secured it in place with electrical tape. Next I'm placing some masking tape on the front and top, leaving a small gap for the silicone to go on. Next I'm placing on a bead of silicone where the top of the tank and the glass door meet. I'm then using my finger to spread it out. Next I'm taking a flat edge, which is a ruler in this case, and smoothing out the top. When doing this, I'm not scraping the silicone off, but just passing over the top to create a smooth finish. You should be left with a bead of silicone at the top of the tank, which is 1 to 2 mm thick, which will act as the hinge. I'm then removing the masking tape whilst the silicone is still wet and then leaving it all to dry for 24 hours. 24 hours later, the silicone is fully dried and it's now working as a hinge. This is an easy way of creating a discrete hinge and it is actually surprisingly strong. Now let's turn the pump on and let the waterfall flow. I absolutely love how it flows down over the rocks and into the open water area. I do want to add some tiny inhabitants into the water, but first I'm going to let the tank grow in for about 4 weeks. Four weeks have passed and I'm glad to say that this paludarium has been thriving. I've done 2 to 3 water changes since setting it up, but that's the only maintenance that I've done. It's been sitting on a rack where it receives 12 hours of light a day, and despite it only being 4 weeks old, it's started to establish really well. All the plants have got some fresh new growth, but my favourite has got to be the new leaf on this Anubias. As expected, the floating plants have been growing a lot and have multiplied fast, so I'm going to remove some. You may have noticed that I have added a new plant, which is this hydrocotyle. I've only planted in a few cuttings, but I love the way it climbs and creeps over the hardscape. Now I think it's about time to add the tiny inhabitants into the water. I'm going to add 5 of these small snails to start off their colony. They're often seen as pests, but they'll pose no threat to the plants and they'll only feed on things like algae. This is beneficial as they'll help keep the water area nice and clean. After introducing them, they get straight to work and start cleaning. Let me know in the comments what you think of this paludarium and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or updates. As always, thank you for making it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. In this video, I'm going to create a rainforest style ecosystem for these stunning dart frogs that even has a flowing waterfall. Let's waste no time and jump straight into the build. I'll be using this glass tank that I made myself from greenhouse glass. It's a Euro style vivarium with vents on the bottom and top for good airflow. I'll try and find a link to something similar and leave it in the description. The first step is to get a background installed. Over the years I've tried many different backgrounds, but one that I really like is using this compressed cork board. This is specific for terrariums and it is safe for live creatures. After taking a few measurements, I'm going to cut it down to size. It doesn't need to reach all the way to the bottom as the drainage layer and substrate would take up this space. With the back done, I'm now going to cut both sides as well. The next step is to get these panels secured onto the glass. The best thing to use for this is going to be some aquarium silicone. Don't just use any old silicone, make sure it's labelled as aquarium or fish safe. After applying a generous amount, I'm pressing the panels onto the glass, starting with the back piece. I've wedged in a few cut-offs which will help anchor them in place whilst the silicone dries. A bit of time has passed since the last clip and I've moved into a new house and created this new ecosystem room. There's been so much to do that I had to push this project to the side, but now it's time to pick it back up and I'm really excited to keep on working on it. I'll add some detail to the background later, but for now I'm going to start working on the hardscape. As for what I'm going to use, I've got a few large pieces of this cork bark. Compared to some other hardscape options of this size, it's really quite affordable and yet does not lack in detail or looking natural. After a little while of experimentation, I quite like how this piece sits and I think it'll be a great place to start and build from. To secure the cork bark in place, I'm using some expanding foam. After about 20 minutes, the surface is dried enough to touch, but it's still wet inside. This is the perfect opportunity to press and shape the foam before it cures. It's the next day and the foam is dried and the cork bark is locked in place nice and solid. I can now build on the hardscape with a couple more pieces. Now that the foam is dried, I'm going to start carving it down and start thinking about the water feature. Because I shaped the foam whilst it was still wet, it's got the basic shape and there's really not much carving to be done. The most important thing is that the shiny surface layer of the foam is completely removed. It needs more work, but it's going to do for now. So I want a waterfall that flows down high from the scape into an open section of water at the base. My plan is for the waterfall to start behind this branch at the back, flow down to the right, between these two branches, and then to an open pond in the bottom left. I'm using a marker pen to draw out the ideal flow of the water. I find this helps visualise the flow and makes carving much easier. That's the upper carving done for now, but I still need to create the bottom section of the waterfall. Before I do that, I do want to work a little bit more on the background as it's looking quite flat and boring. I'm going to use this wire brush to create some depth and texture on the cork panels. Doing this should make the cork panels look like a much more natural background. I'm not putting too much time into it as the majority will be covered in plants anyway. I don't know how well you can tell on camera, but it's looking a whole lot better. As for all these shavings, I'm going to bag them up and save them as I'll be using these to cover up the expanding foam later. Next, I'm going to install the drainage for the terrarium. For this build, I'm simply going to use some coarse filter foam. I've cut it to size to fit the base of the terrarium perfectly. The first thing that I'm doing is placing a sheet of cling film over the filter foam. This will ensure that the expanding foam does not stick to it. I want the waterfall to flow down through these two pieces of cork bark. To achieve this, I'm going to need to add some supports for the foam to hold onto. If I don't, it's simply going to fall straight through the gap onto the filter foam. I'm pushing in a bunch of these toothpicks into either side of the cork bark to create some scaffolding. It might not look the neatest, but it should work and hold the expanding foam up whilst it cures. Now that the expanding foam has cured, I can keep carving it down until I achieve the shape of the waterfall that I'm after. Next, I'm going to remove the filter foam from the base and clear up any expanding foam chunks left over. Now I can start work on covering up this expanding foam to make it look more natural. I'm firstly applying some black silicone to the foam and then using my finger to spread it out as best I can. Now I'm going to take the shavings from the cork background and sprinkle them on top of the wet silicone. I'm making sure to push down firm so it sticks down nice and well. I can now use an old paintbrush to brush off the excess and then work on the next patch. I highly recommend doing this stage in small patches at a time opposed to larger ones. The last thing you want is for the silicone to start drying before you can get the cork bark on top. There are a couple small gaps, but for the most part the foam is completely covered and I'm really liking how it looks. After waiting a day for it to dry, I can now clean up the tank as best I can before getting the filter foam drainage back in place. Now I'm using a sharp blade to cut out the rough shape of the pond that the waterfall is going to flow into. This is the benefit of using filter foam in a scape like this one, as it's really quite customizable. To bring a more natural look to the pond, I'm going to place in some lava rocks around the perimeter. These not only look a whole lot better than the jagged edge of the filter foam, but they'll also help hold back the substrate that I'll be adding later. Right now they're just balancing, which will be no good long term, so I'm going to lock them together with the super glue and tissue method. I'm simply wedging some tissue between the rocks and then soaking it in some liquid type super glue. It dries fast, strong, and best of all, it's animal safe. Now that the rocks have been locked together to create a retaining wall, I can now start working on installing the pump for the waterfall. Here I've got a small USB pump which should be perfect for this size water feature. The tricky part is installing it in a way that lets me access it in the future if it ever breaks down and needs replacing. I've cut out a small square in the foam right in the corner of the tank that the pump fits nicely into. The USB plug then fits through a small slit that I've cut in the mesh where it leads outside the tank. With that done, I'm now going to work on the tubing which will get the water from here to the top of the waterfall. I'm starting by installing a 90-degree push fit in, followed by some 10mm tubing poking out the end. Now I'm going to push in this silicone tubing into the 10mm tubing. It fits nice and snug, which is great. This silicone tubing is perfect as it bends nice and easy without kinking or folding over on itself. This makes it nice and easy to get it in the perfect position right at the top of the waterfall. The tubing leads nicely right to the top of the waterfall and will be nice and easy to hide later on with moss and plants. I'm using some toothpicks to pin it down in place before gluing it down with some super glue. Before moving on any further, I want to test out the waterfall to make sure it's working properly. The water follows the desired path perfectly, which really is a relief to see. The water does look like it's flowing a bit weird, and that's just because the stuff that it's on top of is bone dry. After getting it saturated with water and adding some filter foam at the top for a smoother outflow, it's looking a lot more natural. I can already picture different species of moss and plants growing either side, with frogs jumping in and out. With the waterfall test successful, let's carry on with the build. Before I can get the substrate in, I need to plug some holes in the retaining wall so it doesn't end up in the water. This is easy enough to do by ripping apart some filter foam and plug in the small gaps. I've also cut out this section that's going to cover up the filter and stop anything unwanted from getting inside. I'm going to build up the drainage layer slightly higher so the substrate won't be sitting in water. For this, I'm just pouring in a few litres of this fine leaker. I'm going to leave the area around the filter clear just so it's relatively easy to access. For the substrate, I'm going to keep it extremely simple and just use some sphagnum moss. This stuff is great at growing plants and works well as a standalone substrate. It's also widely available and relatively cheap, which is always a positive. I'll try and leave a link to some in the description, as well as most of the other materials used. With the substrate in, I'm going to work on the pond area a bit more. I'm pouring in some fine sand, followed by some gravel to add some detail. Now I think the terrarium is about ready for planting. That's where it's going to really start to take shape and come to life. The first plant to go in is going to be this bird's nest fern. I really like its wavy leaves and I think it's going to add a nice jungly look to the terrarium. Before planting, I've taken it out the pot and removed as much of the soil as I can. As for placement, I think it looks great wedged between these two branches of cork bark. Its roots aren't in the substrate, but I think it's close enough to the waterfall that there'll be constant water dripping through them. Next, I'm going to plant in a few different climbing plants throughout the tank. This first one is a really nice philodendron species that has some beautiful velvet leaves. It's super easy to grow and I think it's going to look great climbing up the cork panels. I've snapped some toothpicks in half and I'm using them to pin the stem in place. With time, the plant will attach itself to the cork panel with its own roots, but this is going to hold it up for now. I'm planting another philodendron over on the left side, pinning it in place same as before. The next climbing plant that I'm going to add is this ficus. I've always had great success with this plant in terrariums and I really like the shape of its long narrow leaves. Once established, it really does start growing fast, so that is something to keep in mind. I'm planting it in the midsection of the waterfall and adding some sphagnum moss under the stem to keep the roots hydrated. I think this peperomia will look great growing at the base of the terrarium. The majority of the plants in this tank have a jungly coloration, so these silver leaves will add a nice contrast. Next, I'm going to plant in some McGravia climbing up the cork panel. These are one of my absolute favourite species to use in terrariums like this one. I'm using some more toothpicks to carefully pin it in place whilst it gets established. The next plant to go in is this stunning begonia. It thrives in low light, so I'm planting it at the bottom of the tank in some shaded areas. Now I want to move on and start adding some plants around the pond at the bottom as well as the sides of the waterfall. Around the pond I'm planting in a number of different Anubias and Bucephalandra species. These are aquatic plants that grow really well at the water's edge. To plant them, I'm wedging them inside gaps between the rocks or using toothpicks to pin them in place. They'll get their nutrients from the water flowing through their roots. Next, I'm going to plant in some of this oak leaf creeping fig so it's growing and climbing up the cork bark. Its leaves stay nice and small and will add some nice detail to the terrarium. It is, however, a slow grower, so it's going to take some time to get established. I do want to plant some moss next, but first I'm going to fill the tank up and get the waterfall flowing. It feels great seeing the waterfall flowing through the tank with all the plants inside. A tank like this isn't complete without some moss, so that's what I'm planting next. This is an aquatic species known as spiky moss. As it's an aquatic species, it is prone to drying out. This means I need to try and place it where it's in constant contact with the water. Even if just a small part is in contact, it should wick up the water and keep the rest of the moss hydrated. After placing in a few floating plants, I think that just about does it for the planting. I haven't completely packed the tank full of plants, and I've left lots of space for these ones to grow in and establish. Packing the tank with plants right away does look great, and you almost get a finished look from day one. The problem is, as soon as they start to grow, the tank becomes overcrowded and they start to compete for resources like light and nutrients. I much prefer to add slightly fewer plants to let them grow, fill out the space, and turn the tank into their own. The first creatures to go inside this tank are these tiny bugs known as springtails. These little guys are like the cleaners of the ecosystem. They'll eat things like mold and decaying matter and turn them into nutrients that the plants can then use to grow. They'll also serve as a constant source of food and enrichment for the frogs. Now, before I introduce the frogs, I want to let the tank grow in and establish for a good while. Here we are 150 days later, and I'm glad to say that this ecosystem is healthy and thriving. In this time, the plants have really settled in and started to shape the tank like I hoped they would. One of the highlights is the Muckgravia that's climbed almost right to the top of the cork panel. My only regret is not planting more of these, as I think they look absolutely stunning. Another plant to highlight is the oakleaf creeping fig. It's been slowly climbing and creeping along the cork branches, and I absolutely love the detail that it adds to the scape. As for the philodendron, it's been doing really well and has got lots of new growth throughout the tank. I don't know about you, but I think these dark velvet leaves suit the scape perfectly and help enhance the rainforest feel. It's starting to spread to the left, which I think is great as it's looking a bit empty over there. The waterfall has continued to flow perfectly, and the moss and plants around it really are thriving. In nature, plants like Anubias and Bucephalandra often grow in conditions similar to this. They're usually found on riverbanks right where water meets land, thriving in the high humidity with water constantly flowing through their roots. I think this setup really helps emulate that and is the reason why they're doing so well. I can't not mention this begonia growing around the pond. It's doing so well, and its stunning dark green leaves add so much detail and interest to the lower parts of the scape. I think that's enough of the plants, so let's get the doors back on and the frogs inside. The first one went in nice and easy, jumping straight out of the tub and under the dark parts of the hardscape to hide out. The second did give me a bit of a scare and decided to scale the glass before jumping down and hiding. I've had these dart frogs for a good number of years now, and they really have been a joy to keep. They're always up to something, whether it's begging for food at the glass or hunting for springtails and other small bugs throughout the tank. This one discovered some springtails on the Anubias and wasted no time digging in before jumping in the pond for a swim. Other than the small critters that they hunt throughout the tank, their main diet consists of fruit flies, which I dust with calcium powder. This ensures that they're getting the right nutrients to stay healthy and strong. In the wild, these frogs would be highly poisonous, but that's not the case in captivity. Because they're not consuming the bugs that give them their toxins, they're not poisonous whatsoever. However, this doesn't mean you should hold them or pet them despite how cute you think they might be. Like the majority of frogs, they've got very sensitive skin that can absorb chemicals from our hands straight into their bodies. Handling should be strictly limited to necessary circumstances such as moving tank or health reasons. These tiny creatures are such a joy to keep, and having them inside a tank like this one only makes it better. I really hope you enjoyed and found this video useful, and I'd love to think that I've inspired you to try something like this yourself. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and as always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'm going to make a terrarium with a working stream that flows down into a mini relaxing pond. Let's get straight into the build. I'm going to start right at the beginning by building the glass tank. Now you might think that building the glass tank is going to be really complex and difficult, but trust me when I say it's not. What I've got here is some frameless glass picture frames, and this is what I'll be using to build the tank. They're cheap to get hold of and really quite easy to cut. The thickness of the glass is just over 2mm. Some picture frames come with 1mm glass. Try and steer clear of these as it's really quite thin and hard to work with. Now I'm going to save myself some work and use the largest piece as the back panel without cutting it whatsoever. To cut the other pieces, here's what you're going to need. Firstly, you're going to need a ruler. What I like to do is place on a few patches of sticky tack to the underside and squish it down so it's pretty much flat. This really gives the ruler some traction and stops it from moving around when cutting the glass, so you get nice straight cuts. You'll also need a marker pen and obviously a glass cutter. When I first heard about cutting glass, I always thought you'll need some big machines to do it properly, but that's not the case. Simple tools like these is all you need. I'll do my best to leave links to all the tools and materials that I'll be using for this build in the description. To start off, I'm marking the glass to the size I want to cut it. Now I'm lining the ruler up and making sure it's as straight as possible. With the glass cutter, I'm firmly pushing down into the glass and pulling it back in one continuous movement. It's important that you don't go over the cut more than once, as this will blunten the tip of the glass cutter. Now as you can see, there's a nice straight score going down the glass. All I'm going to do now is take it to a straight edge and give it a few gentle taps along this straight line. It breaks in half with ease and I'm left with a perfect straight cut. I will be sanding the glass later, but it's important to be careful at this point as it is really quite sharp. I know a lot of people are worried about cutting glass and it can seem quite intimidating. Believe me, you'll be surprised, and it's much easier than you might think. Get hold of some picture frames and start practicing. You'll certainly screw up, as do I, but you'll get there in no time. If you don't like the thought of breaking the glass by hitting it on a straight edge, here's an easy alternative. Take a straight wooden skewer and place it under the score line. All you've got to do then is hold one side down whilst gently pressing the other. It snaps in half with ease. This here is the panel for the top of the tank. I'm going to cut off a small section of the corner. This will allow a USB cord from a pump to be fed through. I used the ruler as leverage to get a nice clean break. Before going any further, what I like to do is a quick test fit of all the pieces. In the past, I've cut all the pieces out, spent a lot of time sanding them down, only to find out that I've made a mistake. Obviously the glass is sharp, so it's got to be assembled with care. A good tip is to use electrical tape, as it doesn't leave any residue on the glass like some other tapes will. All the pieces fit together perfectly, so it's time to get to work sanding. As I'm using picture frame glass for this build, the only edges that need to be sanded are the ones that I cut. The factory edges from the frames are already really smooth. This is really handy, as on most pieces I only need to sand one out of the 4 sides. When sanding glass, make sure that the sandpaper is wet. This stops any glass dust, which is something you definitely don't want to be breathing in. With all the pieces sanded and dried, it's time to start assembling. I'm using some clear aquarium grade silicone. When it comes to the thickness of the silicone bead, it should be no thinner than the thickness of the glass. I like to make it a little bit thicker just to be safe. As you can see, I've already got all the electrical tape ready to lock everything in place. With the back and side panels in, I'm going to add a secondary bead of silicone on the inner seam of the glass. I'm then using my finger to smoothen it out and remove the excess. Adding this secondary bead really helps ensure that there's no leaks. 24 hours have passed and the silicone is fully cured. Before cleaning up the imperfections, I'm firstly going to add the hinged front door. I'm going to show you how to make a strong, seamless joint that allows the door to hinge open at the front. To start off, I'm placing some electrical tape on either side to make sure the door stays in place. Now I'm going to place on 2 strips of masking tape. The first strip is going along the front, flush with the top of the door. The second strip is going along the top of the tank with a small gap being left. It's very important to leave the small gap, as without it the hinge door won't work. There should be the top of the door visible and a portion of the top panel glass visible. Now I'm applying a small bead of silicone along the gap. Next, with my finger, I'm gently spreading out the silicone to make sure that it's in contact with all the glass. It's important not to press down too hard, as you don't really want to be taking much of the silicone off. What I like to do next is take a straight edge like this ruler and gently smoothen out the silicone. Once again, you don't want to be scraping it off, but instead just gently gliding the ruler over the top. This really does make it look much more professional. Now the last thing to do is to take the masking tape off whilst the silicone is still wet. With the tape out the way, you can now see that there is some thickness to the silicone, which is why it's so strong. 24 hours have passed, so now it's time to remove the tape holding the door in place and see how it works. It's working really well, and it's even flexible enough for the door to be folded over onto the top panel. This is really convenient for building the terrarium and maintenance. When closed, there's no gaps whatsoever, and it actually stays closed really well. I've been making these hinged silicone doors for a good while now, and the most common question I get is about the strength of the silicone. To some people's surprise, the silicone is actually extremely strong, and in this case I can hold the entire weight of the tank just by the door. To further show its strength, I'm pulling on the glass door and you can actually see the top panel of glass bending. Considering the glass door is extremely light, I'm not worried about the silicone failing whatsoever. With the door complete, all that's left to do now is to finish up the tank by cleaning up the imperfections. I'm just using a sharp blade to cut off the excess silicone. Here's the tank fully complete. It's only cost me about £10 to make and I'm really happy with it. Before building, there's a couple more things that need to be done. I'm attaching a foam mat to the bottom to protect the glass against uneven surfaces, and then I'm going to do a quick water test. I've said this in previous videos, but I'll say it again. Water testing the tank is essential, as the last thing you want is to find a leak once the build is fully complete. I've left it for over a day and there's no leaks, so it's finally time to start building the terrarium. To start off, it's going to need a drainage layer. For this build, I think the perfect material to use is going to be some coarse filter foam. I'm placing it under the tank and then using a sharp blade to trace around it. Now I can clearly see the lines. I'm going to go ahead and use some scissors to cut it out. It fits nice and snug inside the tank. In a tank like this, a filter foam drainage layer is perfect, as it's extremely light and it will also allow water to freely pass through it. Now let me quickly tell you about my plan for this build. I want to make a slow trickling stream that flows down all the way from the right side of the tank into a pond on the left side. I'm going to start off by making the pond, and for that I'm going to use this smoothie cup lid. It really does look quite ridiculous at the moment, but fingers crossed my plan will work out. With a sharp blade, I'm cutting a hole out for the pond to sit into. This really doesn't have to be neat whatsoever. I'm continuing to take more foam out until I'm happy with how it sits. This here should be about right. You probably noticed that it is sticking out quite a lot, and that's because I have got to account for the substrate as well. With some scissors, I'm cutting out a small slot, which is where the stream will enter the pond. Now let's get to work making the pond look a little bit more natural. To start off, I'm going to use some sandpaper to roughen up the smooth surface of the plastic. The reason I'm doing this is that I'm going to cover the entire inside of the cup in silicone, and this will help it stick much better. Obviously, the massive hole in the bottom needs to be covered up. I'm placing in a few patches of tape to cover up the hole. The tape is only acting as a bridge for the silicone that I'm going to use to seal everything. I've got some black aquarium silicone as well as some crushed lava rock. I've got some larger pieces as well as some really fine dust. I'm applying the silicone in small patches and then using my finger to spread it out. I'm then taking the larger pieces of lava rock, sprinkling them inside, followed by the fine dust. All I've got to do now is press it down into the silicone and pour off the excess. It covers up the plastic really well and looks much more natural. I'm going to continue the same process until the entire inside of the cup is complete. Here it is with everything covered and dried after 24 hours. You will also notice that I have added another layer of silicone on the bottom to sandwich in the hole so there's no leaks. Now let's get to work making the stream that flows into the pond. I've got some leftover pieces of filter foam which I'm going to use to build some height. As you see, they gradually get shorter and shorter as they make their way to the pond. To make the stream, what I'm going to use is some expanding foam. Before applying the foam, I'm going to place in some cling film on the inside of the tank. This will stop the expanding foam sticking to the filter foam and it will mean I can remove it once it's dry. Now I'm applying the foam in the shape that I want the stream. I'm trying not to use too much as I know how much it can expand. After leaving it for a good few hours, it's pretty much fully dried. I can now get rid of the cling film and start carving the foam down. One thing I'm going to do before carving down the foam is use a Sharpie to make a rough guide of the shape of the stream. It hasn't got to be neat whatsoever, but it will give me a rough guideline to follow. Some time has passed and I've pretty much got the stream fully carved down. It really does look quite ridiculous at the moment, but trust me, it should start taking shape soon. Some parts are really quite fragile and flimsy, so I'm using some wooden toothpicks to add some support. When placing it in the tank, you can see the natural slope the water will flow down into the pond. As I'm sure you can see, there's plenty of holes that need to be patched up, so I'm going to start doing that now. I'm placing in a small piece of tissue and then pressing it down into place. Next, I'm going to soak it in some liquid type superglue. The tissue absorbs the glue and dries rock solid in no time at all. Once dried, the glue is inert, making it 100% safe for terrariums. Next, I'm going to patch up this larger hole at the bottom of the stream. I'm using the exact same method as I previously did. The glue and tissue can sometimes cause a reaction, so make sure you're doing it in a well ventilated place or wearing a mask. Now all the large holes have been patched up, it's time to start making the stream look more natural. I'm going to do this with the same method that I've done for the pond, using some black silicone and crushed lava rock. I'm applying the silicone in a small area and then using my finger to spread it out and try and get it in all the gaps and cracks. Then all I've got to do is sprinkle on some crushed lava rock, press it down into place and remove the excess. Now I'm going to repeat the same process until the entire stream is covered. Here's the stream fully covered and left to dry for 24 hours. I'm really liking how it looks and the tank is finally starting to take shape. What I'm going to do now is work on installing the pump. This is a small USB aquarium pump that has an adjustable flow. I want it to sit right in the corner. I'm pulling out the filter foam drainage and cutting a small section where the pump can sit in. I'm also placing in a small piece for it to sit on top of. Now let's work on the output that leads to the top of the stream. I've got a small section of 6mm tubing that fits nicely inside the pump. Next I'm going to place on this 90-degree push fitting. I'm then cutting a slit down the foam for it all to sit into. After placing the stream back in, I've measured and cut another piece of 6mm tube into the correct height. I can then connect it to the push fitting and it should be complete. The only way to find out if it works properly is to give it a test run. It's flowing well, but definitely a bit stronger than I would like. My vision was to have a slow moving, trickling stream and not a fast flowing one, so I'm going to try and fix that now. After a lot of trial and error, I've finally managed to get it flowing just right. As you can see, there's really not much water coming out at all, but I think it works for this terrarium really well. The only way I got this to work properly was by adding a T-push fitting. The majority of the water continues straight back into the drainage with a small amount going up towards the stream. The next thing I need to do is actually join the pond to the stream. I'm placing a small piece of tissue between the two and then soaking it in superglue. It locks the stream and pond together really well and can easily be hidden with some more crushed lava rock. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the purpose of this small hole here. This is where water would drain from the pond to make sure that it doesn't overflow. Now let's finally start installing everything for the final time. I'm feeding the USB cable through the gap I left at the top of the tank. Now I'm taking some filter foam and covering up the pump. This will stop things like substrate from getting down to the intake. I'm now reinstalling the pond and stream and placing in some more filter foam to act as supports. Now it's time for the substrate. For this build, I'm going to use some aquasoil. It contains a good amount of nutrients and has no problem with water constantly running through it. Regular terrarium substrate won't be suitable for this build as it's going to be extremely saturated, which it simply doesn't do well with. After pouring in a decent amount, I've spread it out and given it a light spray down. The output of the pump really doesn't look too good, so I'm going to cover that up before moving on. This is easy enough to do by gluing on some small pieces of lava rock. Now the output's covered up, I'm going to add a couple pieces of spiderwood to make the hardscape look a bit more natural. I'm experimenting with their position before locking them down in place. Now I'm happy, I'm using the super glue and tissue to attach it to the rocks. You don't have to glue the wood down, but I do find it makes planting and maintenance much easier as you haven't got to worry about knocking the hardscape over. I'm really happy with the final hardscape, but it's about to get even better as it's time for the plants. This is an aquatic fern that I've never used before, but I've heard that it does do well in terrarium conditions. After removing all the rock wool, I'm going ahead and planting it inside the tank. When I say planting, it's more wedging it in gaps as this plant is an epiphyte and it'll rot if you plant it in the substrate. Next up, I've got some hygrophila. I really like this plant and I think it will bring a nice jungle feel to the tank. I'm chopping the stems in half so I have double the amount of plants to use. The top half will grow new roots in no time and the bottom half already has a new shoot coming through. This is an easy way to get more plants than what you paid for. With most of the stems cut in half, I'm using some long tweezers to plant them down into the substrate. It's really important not to let the plants dry out, so I'm giving them a light spray down every now and then. Next up, I've got this Anubias which has some stunning arrow-shaped leaves. I was originally going to plant it on the right side, but I think it looks much better over here on the left. I'm using a small amount of gel-type glue to mount it to the spiderwood. Even with just these plants in, the terrarium's already sprung to life. In this gap where the stream flows round, I want there to be a nice pop of colour. I think this Alternanthera mini is the perfect choice. It's a bit browny green at the moment, but once it establishes, it'll be a nice vibrant red. I've washed off the nutrient-rich gel and now I'm planting it down into the substrate. This here is some Monte Carlo and I want it to create a lush green carpet throughout the terrarium. I've once again washed out the nutrient-rich gel and I'm now splitting it up into smaller pieces. I can now start planting it into the aquasoil. With time, it will grow and spread and all the gaps should fill in nicely. To add some more contrast in the planting, I've got some small crypts and some Anubias and Bucephalandra. I'm mainly planting them in areas that I want to bring a little bit more detail to. With the planting almost complete, I'm going to add a couple patches of Christmas moss here and there. I'm really liking how this tank's looking after the planting, so let's get it filled up with water and turn on the stream. It's amazing to finally see the water trickling down the stream and slowly filling up the pond. I'm using some tubing to siphon out the water along with all the aquasoil I spilt in the pond. Now it's filled back up, I'm going to add some floating plants. I absolutely love the miniature scale they bring to the pond and the rest of the tank. Now it's time to add some springtails. These tiny bugs will eat things like mould and decaying matter throughout the terrarium. They're even more important in a tank like this as I used a good amount of spiderwood which is always prone to growing mould in the first few weeks. With the tank complete, all that's left to do now is to let everything grow in and establish. Two months have passed and it's really quite amazing how well this terrarium is doing. All the plants have grown in and established really well and there's been little to no die-off whatsoever. My favourite has got to be this Monte Carlo, which has grown into a big soft cushion. You can also get a glimpse of the healthy root system that it sent out. Another plant that is doing really well is the Alternanthera mini. It's gone from this to this in just 8 weeks, and it's really added that pop of colour that I was looking for. The stream is still flowing perfectly, and I often find myself watching it slowly trickling down through all the plants. As we get to the pond, it's still functioning just as I hoped it would, and the Monte Carlo makes it look even more natural with it growing around the edge. The floating plants do grow relatively fast, so I do have to remove them every now and then, but this is easy enough done with a fork. Another worthwhile mention is this new Anubias leaf, which is absolutely stunning. The plants in the background have still got some growing to do, but until then I'm going to sit back and enjoy watching the stream trickle down through the scape into the pond. If you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy this one where I make a flowing waterfall paludarium. In this video, I'll be making a giant multi-species ecosystem that's not only home to fish and shrimp, but also a group of deadly predators known as vampire crabs. I'll be following the paludarium from day 1 all the way to day 150, and believe me, it completely transforms. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. It's going to be a good one. I'll be building the paludarium inside this 160 litre aquarium. As for the lighting, I'm not going for anything crazy, and I'm just using this budget Nicro aquarium light. It's very affordable and comes with a dimmer and built-in timer, which is always handy. I've got some cork panels, and I think they'll be perfect for the background inside this paludarium. I'm using a sharp blade to cut this panel in half before giving it a quick test fit inside the tank. They fit nice and snug for now, but I will have to attach them more permanently. I've gone ahead and cut the sides out as well, and I'm already starting to like how it looks. It is really flat and boring at the moment, but I'll show you some techniques shortly that will add some really nice detail. To attach the cork panels to the glass, I'm going to use some aquarium silicone. I'm applying a generous amount onto the cork panel and then going ahead and pressing it down onto the glass. It holds it in place right away, but it will take a good 24 hours for it to fully cure. I've attached all the panels and left them overnight to dry. To add some more depth and interest to the background, I'm going to add a few cut-offs in certain places. Toothpicks come in handy to temporarily pin them down in place. The rectangular shape obviously doesn't look very natural, so I'm breaking off the edges. I can then use more silicone to attach the cork panels together before going ahead and placing them inside the tank. This is a really easy and simple way to add some nice depth and interest to a once flat, boring background. I've saved you some time and attached a few more throughout the tank and waited till the next day for them to dry. They're all nice and sturdy, which is perfect. As I'm sure you're aware, the background isn't looking too natural at the moment with the sharp edges and flat faces, so let's change that. I'm going to carve down the foam with a drill that has a wire brush attachment. If you haven't got a drill, a handheld wire brush also works well. All I'm doing is carving down the surface of the foam to create some nice texture, as well as giving it some high and low points. You can be as creative as you want on how you carve down the cork panels, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it as the majority will be covered in moss and plants anyway. After about half an hour of carving, here's the result. It's certainly nothing crazy, but I like how it looks, and I think it will serve as a great background for this ecosystem. As I'm sure you can see, it does create quite a mess at the bottom of the tank, so let's get that cleaned up. The best way I've found to remove all of this is scooping out as much as you can and then going around with a hoover. I'm also making sure to go over the cork panels as well, as a lot of it is stuck between the gaps. With the tank clean and the background in place, the paludarium is really starting to take shape. Now I'm going to start working on the hardscape. I've got a good selection of these large maple leaf rocks, and I think they'll fit the scape that I've got in mind really well. I'm firstly placing in some pieces of foam that would distribute the weight of the rocks and help protect the glass. Now I can start placing in the maple leaf rocks. The main purpose of these large rocks is to create a barrier that will separate the water area from the land area. They'll create a retaining wall that will hold substrate back and stop it from getting into the water. At this stage, it's really important to take your time, as these rocks will create a foundation and quite literally determine the rest of the scape. After many hours of placing the rocks in and pulling them back out, here's the layout that I've came up with. My favourite part about it has got to be this indented bay area where the water will be a lot shallower, being only an inch or two deep. I'm hoping it will serve as a hotspot for crabs to relax in where they haven't got to venture out into deeper waters. There's no way I can build a scape like this without creating some kind of flowing water feature. I've placed a small pump in the corner of the tank, and now I'm using some egg crate light diffuser to create a box around it. I'll attach these two pieces together with some zip ties. This will allow me to access the pump once the build is complete and change it or clean it if I ever needed to. It fits around the pump nicely, so I'm going to go ahead and attach it in place with some super glue. Whilst the glue dries, I'm going to cut down this filter foam so it fits nicely around the pump box. These will help filter out the water as it gets pulled into the pump. As for the water feature, I've got this cool piece of driftwood which I think will look great with water running down the centre. I want it to sit here where the water can flow down it into the open bay area. My plan is to build a structure right at the top for the water to flow down like a stream into the back of the driftwood and then out into the open water. This might be a bit ambitious, but I think it's worth a go. To start off, I'm attaching the driftwood to the background using the superglue and tissue method. Now that it's dry and nice and sturdy, I can start building the skeleton for the flowing waterfall. I've got some toothpicks and I'm going to poke them into the cork panel to act almost like scaffolding. I'm going to add some expanding foam shortly to build the structure, and these toothpicks should hold it in place and stop it from falling straight to the floor. For the areas where the toothpicks can't reach, I'm using some long wooden skewers snapped in half. Now this really does look like an absolute mess, but trust me, it should make sense soon. If I applied the foam now, it's likely going to expand through all the gaps in the egg crate. A piece of cardboard along with some filter foam in the top will help fix that problem. Now it's time to start building the waterfall structure with the expanding foam. I'm applying it in between and on top of the wooden toothpicks that I pushed into the background. As you can see, it's holding the foam up in place really well, and this makes a really good alternative to having to flip the tank over on its back. I'm pushing in a few more toothpicks as I want the foam to come out a bit further in this area. I'm trying not to apply overly too much as it does expand a lot, as you can see here. A few hours have passed and the foam is fully hardened, and it really is quite solid, which is great. Before carving the foam down, I like to use a marker pen to quickly sketch out a guide to follow. The red line is the path I want the water to take, and I find doing this step makes carving much easier. To carve the foam down, all I'm using is my hands to pull off chunks. I've made good progress with the carving, but I've had an idea that I think can add another level of detail to this ecosystem. I want to try and create a dark cave area right here underneath the flowing waterfall. This maple leaf rock should do the job. After a bit of experimentation with a large rock, here's what I've came up with. I really like the dark and gloomy aspect that it brings to the tank, and I think it will be a great hiding area for the vampire crabs. It is a bit wobbly, and the last thing I want is for it to fall down and crack the glass, so I'm going to use some super glue and tissue to lock it down in place. Now that it's nice and sturdy, I can use some more expanding foam to fill in the void behind it. Now it's dry, I'll save you some time and carve it down off camera. All the foam has now been carved down, and as I'm sure you can see, it's really not looking too natural, so I'll fix that shortly. I should mention I've made a hole in the top of the foam, which is where the outlet of the pump will go and the water will flow down from. Covering up the expanded foam is going to make a big mess, so I'm removing all the rocks from the tank, which will make the cleanup easier. What I'll be using is some black aquarium silicone along with some crushed maple leaf rocks. To make this, I simply put some rocks in a bag and crush them down with a hammer. I'm firstly going to apply some black silicone onto the expanding foam. I'll then use my finger to spread it out and try and get it in all the gaps and cracks. I'm now taking the crushed rock, pouring it on top and pushing it down into the silicone. I'll repeat the same process until all the foam is covered in maple leaf rock. I do recommend working in small patches at a time, as the last thing you want is for the silicone to dry before you get the rocks on. I've covered the entire waterfall, let it dry for 24 hours and brushed off all the excess. I'm really happy with how it's looking, but as you can see there is still a few patches of foam that I missed. Instead of using more silicone and having to wait 24 hours for it to dry, I'm using super glue, which is a much quicker alternative. Now the waterfall's done, I can get all the hardscape back inside the tank. Now before I get any drainage or substrate into the land area, I need to patch in these holes between the maple leaf rocks, or it's all going to spill out into the water area. The easiest way to do this is to take some filter floss and push it into the holes. You won't be able to see it by the end, as I'll easily be able to hide it with moss and plants. Now it's time to pour in the drainage layer for the land area. What I'm using for this is Leaker. It's lightweight and porous, making it perfect for this task. The purpose of the drainage layer is to build an elevated foundation that the substrate can then sit on top of. This will stop the substrate getting waterlogged from constantly sitting in water. It's important that the depth of the drainage layer is above the intended depth of the water inside the paludarium. In this case, the drainage layer is roughly 14 centimeters deep, and I intend for the water to be about 9 to 10 centimeters deep. Before going any further, I really want to test out the pump and see how the waterfall flows. I've attached a long tube to the pump that goes down to the bottom of the filter box that I made earlier. It has a 90-degree push fitting at the end that fits nicely into the top of the waterfall. Now that some water's in the tank, let's give it a test run. This is certainly not what I intended, but it's nothing a few adjustments can't fix. After slightly changing the angle and adding a small piece of filter foam, it flows much better. I really love how it flows through the driftwood and trickles down into the water. The black filter foam is only temporary, as I'll be able to create the same effect with moss later. With the water feature working just how I hoped, I'm going to clear out the tank and start working on the substrate. First off, I'm going to place in some window screen mesh that will act as a substrate barrier and stop the substrate from getting down into the drainage layer. On top of this, I'm going to pour in some crushed lumpwood charcoal that will help remove any impurities inside the ecosystem. Now I can start getting the substrate in. I'm using a slightly different mix to normal, which will hopefully help the crabs inside this ecosystem thrive. I'll put the mix up on screen now. For my regular viewers, you'll notice that it doesn't contain charcoal, and it does contain a higher ratio of worm castings. The reason for this is that I know vampire crabs like to burrow, and I don't want their tunnels collapsing. I've tested this mix and it holds up well against caving. The camera really flattens it out, but the substrate is about 10 centimeters deep at the back. For the cave on the right side, I'm taking a slightly different approach due to the water feature. This area is going to have water constantly dripping through it, so I don't want to use regular substrate, as I'm worried it will stagnate and leach into the water. I've chose aquasoil as it holds up much better when constantly wet. Now the substrate's in, I can get back to work on the hardscape. I've got a few of these driftwood branches which I think will look great inside this tank. The idea is to place them in to make them look like they're all joined together and one large piece of wood. Some time has passed and here's what I've come up with so far. I hope you can see what I mean when I said that I want it to look like one piece of driftwood instead of just individual branches. It's currently balancing in place with some wooden skewers, which obviously isn't a long-term fix. I'm going to get it secured in place with the superglue and tissue method. I'm wedging a small piece of tissue between the wood and cork panel and then soaking it in liquid type superglue. I'll ensure that each piece has multiple contact points to make sure it's nice and sturdy and not going anywhere. I'll then continue building it up piece by piece. Here's how it's looking and I'm really happy with it. I still feel like the scape is a bit empty, so I've got a few bits that I want to add. The first is some driftwood on the right, and then I want something in this open area of water on the left. I got hold of this really cool spiderwood root which I think will work perfectly. The bulk of the wood will sit above the water, but it's got these pieces that reach down and will create a nice sheltered area for all the life inside the water. Next, I'm going to get to work on the shallow bay area of the paludarium. I want this area to only be a few centimeters deep and taper out into the open water. I'm filling up a mesh bag with some aquasoil. I want there to be lots of plants in this area, so this will provide the nutrients. I'm now pouring on some gravel to fill in any gaps around it and give it a centimeter or two layer on the top. I've added a couple rocks towards the front to stop the gravel from rolling out into the foreground. I'm now going to start working on the decorative gravel layer at the base of the paludarium. I'm starting by pouring in some coarse gravel followed by some fine sand. Next I'm adding some natural pea gravel mainly around the base of the maple leaf rocks. Now some smaller maple leaf rocks can be placed throughout the foreground and I think that'll do it. I'm really happy with how the foreground's turned out, and I think the combination I chose of sand, gravel and rocks really adds to the natural look. With the hardscape complete, this ecosystem is looking better than I could imagine and I can't wait to get some plants in. Before I get started adding the plants, I'm giving the entire paludarium a really good spray down. There's going to be a whole load of plants going in this build, but let's kick it off with this fern. I've taken it out the pot and removed all the soil. I can now dig a small hole into the substrate, plant the roots inside, and then compress the substrate back down around it. Sticking with ferns, I've got a couple nice clumps of trident fern. I'll split these up even further and plant them in gaps and cracks throughout the scape. I'm mainly trying to plant it right on the water's edge so its roots will be underneath the water and its leaves will be above. I've got even more trident fern, but this piece is mounted onto a piece of spiderwood. This is even easier to plant as I can simply place it inside the paludarium, and it also adds to the detail of the hardscape. I think this open patch on the right side will look good with a lush carpeting plant. I've got some Monte Carlo which should be perfect for this. I'm using my hands to plant in small patches, and with time they'll send out runners and form one dense carpet. Next I've got this really unique plant nicknamed the mini palm tree plant. It grows great in humid setups like this one, but I'm not sure how it would do growing in the aquasoil, but I think it's worth a go. Every now and then I'm making sure to give the tank a good spray down to make sure the plants don't dry out. I know I've finished with the hardscape, but I keep on getting sidetracked with new ideas to add even more detail. I'm placing in this piece of driftwood to look like an old tree stump that was growing on the water's edge. I do think it adds some nice detail. Now back to the planting. I've got various species of Anubias and Bucephalandra that I'm planting throughout the tank. These plants are epiphytes, so to plant them you can simply wedge them inside gaps and cracks. Alternatively, you can even use a small amount of gel type superglue to mount them in place like I'm doing here. Similar to the trident fern, I'm planting them at a level where their roots will be underneath the water and their leaves will be growing up above. This will allow the roots to pull nutrients from the water to keep it nice and clean, and it'll also give the leaves easy access to CO2 in the air. Next to go in is this Alternanthrum mini. Its leaves are a brown colour at the moment, but under good lighting it grows really nice vibrant red leaves. Next up is this miniature begonia. It's got these stunning small iridescent leaves. I'm laying it on top of some damp sphagnum moss and I'm hoping it will slowly climb up the cork panels. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of white glue marks where I glued the hardscape down in place. These will be easy enough to cover up. I've placed in some damp sphagnum moss and now I'm going to plant in this oak leaf creeping fig. Whilst planting this, I've had a sudden idea that I think could look really cool. As you know, I made a few parts of the background pop out that give it a bit more depth. With this one, I'm going to use a sharp blade to cut out a pocket inside it. Now that there's a decent sized pocket cut out, I'm going to place inside some sphagnum moss. I can now take some more oak leaf creeping fig and plant it on top. I think it will look really cool if this entire section of background is completely carpeted with this climbing plant. I'm going to plant a few patches of this hygrophila and some crypts, and then I'm going to move on to planting the waterfall. I want lots of moss and plants growing around the water feature, but I think it's best to get it up and running before planting them. I've placed in a square of filter foam inside the filter box, followed by the pump. I'm now cutting some more filter foam to size that will block up the hole. I'm taking extra care to make sure there's no holes whatsoever so no creatures get down towards the pump. A small piece of driftwood on the top covers up the foam and makes it look a whole lot better while still giving me easy access if I ever need to access the pump. Now that the water feature is good to go, let's get some water inside the paludarium. I'm slowly filling it up to avoid disrupting the sand or plants too much. I'm only filling it about halfway, but that'll be more than enough to get the waterfall flowing. It's so good to see the waterfall flowing just as I hoped it would, and you can really get a glimpse of how the bay area is going to look. Once filled up, it will only be an inch or so deep, and I think it will look really good with the water gently flowing out into the open tank. I'm going to plant some moss throughout the waterfall, starting with this edge here. I'm going to use an aquatic species of moss known as Christmas moss. The main requirement when planting is that the moss is in contact with some water, as this will keep it damp and stop it from drying out. With time, it will slowly spread over the hardscape. I'll also use this moss to cover up any glue marks throughout the tank. I'm using some tweezers to poke a hole down into the foam, and then I'm going to plant some hygrophila inside. Although these cuttings have no substrate, they'll pull their nutrients from the water flowing through them. I think another carpet of Monte Carlo on the left here will add to the tank nicely. I'll also plant a crypt right behind it which will grow denser and taller with some time. Now that the majority of the planting that will grow above the water is done, let's start getting in some plants that will grow under it. I want a fine-leaved plant in the bay area that the fish and shrimp can swim amongst. I think some hairgrass is going to be absolutely perfect for this. I've switched off the waterfall and I'm using some long tweezers to plant small clumps down into the gravel. Once it grows in a bit denser, I think it will serve as a really good refuge for baby shrimp and fish to hide out. Throughout the rest of the tank, I'll plant in a few more species, mainly around the rocks, that will grow in nicely with some time. After placing in a few more patches of moss and planting in some more climbing plants in the background, I can get the paludarium filled up with water. The waterfall can now be switched back on. This small section of the tank has by far got to be one of my favourites. I can't wait to see life swimming amongst the plants and enjoying this unique part of the tank. I think floating plants are going to be a great addition to this tank as they'll add some nice detail to the water's surface and also provide an extra layer of cover for the creatures I'll be adding later. This paladarium is not going to work without a lid as the plants inside require high humidity and the vampire crabs that I'm going to add later will easily escape, which is something we definitely don't want. I've built these lids myself with some picture frame glass along with some window screen mesh to improve the airflow. I've made 3 of them to sit on top of the tank, with the one on the right having the corner cut out to allow the wire to easily feed through. I'll plug any remaining holes around the wire with some filter foam. These 2 gaps then get covered up with long strips of glass that have a suction cup attached to the top. These will allow me to easily spray the tank with water or place in some food without having to take one of the lids off. I'm really happy with this lid design and there's only tiny minimal gaps, so I haven't got to worry about escapees. To further improve the airflow, I'm going to add a couple USB fans that will sit on the left and right side of the tank. I've glued on some black skewers and mounted them to some suction cups that allows me to easily remove them whenever I need to take the lids off. I've hooked them up to a timer that turns on multiple times a day for a few minutes to blow fresh air inside the tank. In a big tank like this one, good airflow is going to help reduce mould and stop the glass from being constantly steamed up. The paladarium's complete, but trust me, it's going to completely transform over the coming months, so don't go anywhere. It's been 6 weeks since I set this paladarium up and I'm glad to say that it's been thriving. I'll be documenting this tank all the way up to day 150 and adding some amazing creatures as I go. Above the water, the plants have started to grow in really nicely, but below is a different story. For the most part, it's not looking too bad, but there has been a bit of an algae problem. It's mainly growing on the dwarf hairgrass inside the shallow bay area. I'll add some creatures shortly that will help tackle this issue. It's quite hard to notice, but I've installed a small water pump on the left side of the tank as there really wasn't much water movement over here. As for the waterfall, it's still flowing perfectly and the moss I planted around it has spread so much and got so much new growth. I completely forgot to film it, but 6 weeks ago when I made this ecosystem, I did add some springtails and isopods which have been working hard to keep this ecosystem clean and healthy. With that said, I think the water needs its own cleanup crew, so I think it's about time we add some creatures. This is a small group of red cherry shrimp. They'll not only add some dynamic life to the water, but they'll also help clean up the algae and eat decaying plant matter. It's been just over 3 weeks since the last look at this ecosystem and the plants have continued to grow in really well. The oak leaf creeping fig has slowly been spreading and climbing up the background just like I hoped it would. Now let's take a look into the water as something really exciting has happened. Not only have the shrimp been hard at work cleaning the algae, but they've also had some tiny babies. They're no older than a day old and haven't even got any red coloration yet. The crazy thing is that only one of the females' eggs have hatched and there's still 3 more females with loads of eggs that are going to hatch in the coming days. This will cause an explosion in the population, but I'm not too worried about that as I'll soon be introducing some predators that will help keep their numbers in check. This won't be for a few weeks yet, so let's first get some maintenance done. Some of the oak leaf creeping fig has grown right to the top of the tank, so I'm going to trim it down and replant it in a way that will help it grow more horizontally. I'm also going to trim back a few of the other plants that are getting a bit tall. I'm making sure to replant the cuttings as this will help create some denser growth. As for other maintenance, I've been doing a water change every few weeks and spraying the tank down once a day. The paladarium is now over 100 days old and it really has gone from strength to strength. The cherry shrimp have been doing their job as there's pretty much zero algae to be seen. The babies that were born just over 6 weeks ago have grown in so much and are working just as hard as their parents. Talking about the parents, they've just hatched another 40 plus shrimp, so I think it's about time for some predators to help keep the population in check. I'm introducing 8 of these beautiful emerald rasboras. They're a dwarf species that won't be getting much bigger than this, so they'll only be hunting the small shrimplets. The shrimp population won't be completely depleted as there'll always be a handful that survive by hiding amongst the dense plant growth. The paladarium is now 18 weeks old and it keeps on looking better and better as the weeks go by. I'll be introducing the apex predators into this ecosystem soon, but first let's take a look under the water to see how life is unfolding. The emerald rasboras have been doing a great job at maintaining a healthy shrimp population. They're a lot less shy than they once were and there's always a few of them out and about at any given time, which is great to see. Despite them only being tiny creatures, they do seem to be very territorial. There seems to be about 3 groups that control different areas of the tank. A group occupies the deeper, calm waters on the right side of the tank, with another group that dart in and out of the shallow bay area and another that enjoy the faster flowing waters on the left side of the tank. It really is great to observe this behaviour and I think it's safe to say that they're thriving inside this setup. One of my favourite things is seeing how much they enjoy the extremely shallow water inside the bay. There's always a few hanging out in there despite them being hard to spot due to their effective camouflage. Without further ado, it's about time to introduce the creatures that this ecosystem was designed for. This is a vampire crab. They're a semi-terrestrial freshwater species native to Indonesian rainforests. Don't let their slow movement fool you as they're deceivingly fast. Believe it or not, that's not been sped up whatsoever. They use this speed to escape potential threats and to catch their prey. Now let's introduce them to their new home. This first crab makes its way to the water's edge to take some shelter under a leaf. I'm going to be adding 4 in total and I think it's best I add them to separate areas of the tank so they have their own space to settle in. This next one is wearing a mossy wig, so it ran straight to the water to wash it off and have a refreshing bath. This crab seemed a bit hesitant and didn't want to come out, but after some gentle encouragement with some tweezers, it was soon exploring the tank. I introduced the last one into the back left corner of the tank, and now I think it's best to let them settle in for a good few weeks. The paladarium is now 150 days old and I think it's safe to say that it's looking better than ever. It really is amazing just how much the plants have grown in the 22 weeks that this tank has been set up. For reference, here's how it looked on day 1 and here's how it looks today. It really has transformed into a lush slice of nature and it's truly been a joy to watch. My favourite angle to look into this tank has got to be from above. It really feels like you're peering through a window into the rainforest. Before showing you how the crabs are getting on, I do want to take a closer look at some of the plants. The oak leaf creeping fig is slowly but steadily covering the background and I absolutely love how it looks. The begonia lita that I planted in the substrate has made its own way onto the cork background and I think it adds some nice variety to the oak leaf creeping fig. A true highlight of the tank for me is the flowing waterfall with the lush moss and plants that are growing around it. Dare I say it, but it might need a trim back soon as you can barely see the water flowing down until it gets to the driftwood. When it comes to the water section inside the paludarium, it's continued to flourish with the fish and shrimp thriving. The shrimp have continued to breed and are at a healthy population. They really have done a great job at keeping the tank clean, as there's no algae to be seen anywhere. As for the emerald rasboras, they seem to be getting more and more confident each and every day, which is great to see. One concern you might have is whether the vampire crabs are eating the fish and shrimp. I can definitely say they haven't got any of the fish, as all 8 are still alive and healthy. As for the shrimp, I definitely can't count them all up, so I'm not completely sure. There's certainly no dent in the population, so my best guess is that the shrimp are just too fast and agile for them. Talking about the crabs, let's take a look at how they're getting on inside the paludarium. Similar to the rasboras, they seem to have occupied their own territories throughout the ecosystem. This one occupies the dark cave area underneath the waterfall. I often catch it venturing out on top of the waterfall to snack on some algae that's growing amongst the moss. Not gonna lie, if I was a crab, this is probably the spot I'd choose. All the way on the other side of the tank lives this vibrant individual. This crab seems to control the back left corner of the tank and enjoys venturing out onto the side of the cork bark and on the top of the spiderwood. Although I can't confirm it, it likely has a burrow back there where it spends most of its time in the day, so this is a lucky appearance. Talking about burrows, here's one that can be seen. Right underneath the driftwood is a hole that a vampire crab has dug out. I often catch it right at the entrance of the burrow, but I haven't managed to get it on camera as it always scurries down before I can press record. As for the last crab, I'm not completely sure where it lives, but my best guess is amongst the dense plant growth right here. It really has been amazing to watch the creatures inside this setup thrive, and it's been an absolute joy to watch this ecosystem transform from day 1 all the way to day 150. I'd love to hear what you think of this build in the comments and what other livestock you'd potentially add. This certainly won't be the last you see of this paludarium, as I've already got some changes and additions that I want to make, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching. In this video, I'll show you how I made this stunning waterfall paludarium, and I'll even be introducing some tiny inhabitants at the end. I'll be making the tank out of these frameless picture frames. I've already shown this process a few times on the channel, so I won't go into too much detail. The main tools you'll need is a glass cutter, a marker pen and a ruler. I used the ruler and the marker pen to mark out the desired length on the glass and then score it with the glass cutter. Then after a few taps on a straight edge, it breaks easily. I then did a quick test fit. Everything fit together perfectly, so I went on to sand everything down. Once all the glass was sanded, cleaned and dried, I used some silicone to join them together. Make sure you use 100% silicone, or silicone that's advertised as aquarium or fish safe. I then pieced everything together and constantly checked to make sure everything was square and in place. 24 hours later and the silicone has fully cured. I used a sharp blade to clean off the excess silicone off camera. I should mention that the top piece has a small gap. This is where the wire of the pump will go through. When making these tanks, it's always a good idea to attach a foam mat on the bottom for them to sit on. This will help prevent it breaking or cracking due to it sitting on unlevel surfaces. To attach it to the bottom of the tank, I simply use some double-sided tape. With that in place, I'm now going to do a quick water test to make sure there's no leaks. The tanks I make very rarely have a leak, but it's always good to test just in case. A good few hours have passed and there's no leaks, so it's time to move on. This here is a piece of coarse filter foam. I'll be using it for the drainage of this paludarium. It's very lightweight and will have the added benefit of filtering the water as it gets sucked into the pump. When it comes to the scape I want to make, I want a structure of rocks to form the waterfall which flows down into an open section of water. To make this happen, I'm going to start by cutting out the water section from the filter foam. This is easily done with a pair of scissors. I constantly placed it back inside the tank and then took it out and trimmed more off where necessary. Here's what I came up with. As you can see, I cut out a slope from the base to create a more natural transition. This probably wasn't necessary as it'll all be covered in rocks later anyway. Talking about rocks, let's start making the hardscape. I've got a ton of these lava rocks which all range in size. Piece by piece, I'm starting to put together the waterfall. This definitely was a case of trial and error and did take some time to start off. To join the rocks together, I'll be using the superglue and tissue method. I simply tore off a small section of tissue, wedged it in between the rocks and then soaked it in superglue. It dries quickly and forms a plant-safe, strong bond. I should mention that I'll leave links to all the materials and plants I'll be using for this build in the description below. Here's how it looks with a few more rocks in place. It's slow progress, but I'm starting to see it come together. Here's the majority of the rocks together and all super glued in place. I'm really happy with how it's looking, but there's still plenty of work to be done. Now I'm going to take the leftovers of the filter foam, break it into small pieces and start wedging it inside the gaps and cracks of the rocks. You'll see why I'm doing this shortly. With all the large gaps filled in with filter foam, it's time to move on to the next step. Now I'm going to take this expanding foam and apply it to the back side of the rock structure. This will help ensure that the water flows properly instead of it just falling through all the gaps. When applying the foam, try not to use too much as it does expand a lot. About 15 minutes have passed and as you can see the foam has expanded quite a lot. At this point it's not fully cured, but it's dried enough to the point where you can touch it and start to shape it. A couple hours have passed and now the foam is fully cured. At this point I'm going to remove all the filter foam in the gaps and cracks. You can probably guess why I did this now. If I didn't, the foam would have expanded through all the gaps, which is definitely not ideal. Now the waterfall will flow properly, it's time to make it look a little nicer. I'm going to cover up all the glue and foam marks with crushed lava rock. This stuff's easy to make by putting some lava rock in a bag and crushing it up with a hammer. I'm simply going to apply some super glue to the area I want to cover up and then sprinkle on some crushed lava rock. I then remove the excess and as you can see it creates a seamless joint between the two rocks. I'm going to repeat the same process until all the marks are covered. Now it's all covered, it definitely looks 10 times better. Now I'm going to move on and start installing the pump. I'll be using this small aquarium pump. It's a similar one I used to my flowing stream terrarium and that's been doing well, so I thought I'd stick with it. To install it, I'm firstly going to cut out a square from the filter foam for it to sit into. It certainly doesn't have to be exact and just a rough cutout will do. Now I'm going to place the hardscape back in and check if everything fits okay. It fit well, but I decided to turn it 90 degrees to make installing the tubing later on a little bit easier. That's looking much better. To get the cable through the hole, I'm going to take your guys' suggestions from the flowing stream terrarium and take the head of the plug off. I then fed the wire through the hole and then started to reassemble the plug. With that done, I went on to make this output from the pump. It's made out of some 10mm tubing with a 90-degree angle at the top. I attached it to the output of the pump and then placed it inside the paladarium. I then placed the hardscape back in and now I'm going to do a water test for the pump. I filled the tank up until the intake of the pump was submersed in water and then plugged it in. There was a fair few bubbles at first, but after about 10 minutes it was pretty much silent and I'm really happy with how it flows. With the test done and successful, it's time to reassemble the paladarium for the last time. Now that I won't be taking out the lava rock structure anymore, I'm going to add a few more pieces. I'm also going to add a few pieces at the top to help cover up the output of the pump. Once again, I attach these in place with the super glue and tissue method. As it is, I feel the hardscape's a little boring. Spiderwood would solve this problem easily. Like always, I experimented with a few different layouts and structures before I finally settled on one. I'm really happy with how it looks and I definitely think the spiderwood adds to the scape. I made sure to secure it in place, but I'll hide the glue marks with moss and plants later on. Now it's time to move on to the substrate. If I was to pour it in now, it would fall through all the gaps and cracks throughout the scape. This was an easy problem to solve by taking some leftover filter foam and wedging it in place. Whilst I was at it, I used some more filter foam to cover up the pump. This will help ensure that no unwanted materials such as the substrate will be sucked up by the pump. Now I can actually start getting the substrate inside. If I haven't mentioned already, I'll be using aquasoil for the substrate of this paladarium. It holds a good amount of nutrients and will have no problem with water constantly running through it. My regular terrarium substrate mix would not be suitable for this build. After pouring the substrate in and gently patting it down, I'm going to give the whole tank a good spray down. With that done, I can now start bringing the paladarium to life with plants. I've got this Anubias which I mounted to a rock with some superglue. I'm going to plant it in the back corner of the paladarium. As this plant is an epiphyte, it's important that its rhizome is not planted into the substrate. These here are a few cuttings from some of my other projects that have been growing really well. I'm once again going to plant these towards the back. Although these are rootless cuttings at the moment, they'll soon send out new roots and start growing in no time. I made sure to plant a couple different species to bring a variety of different leaf shapes, colours and textures. Doing this will always help create the most natural looking scape. I'm liking how the paladarium's looking even with just a few plants in. Next I'm going to plant this bulbitis fern. Before planting it I need to take it out of the pot and remove all the rock wool. There are some super tiny pieces which I definitely don't want to be wasting. With all the rock wool cleaned off, I can now start placing it inside the paladarium. Similar to the Anubias, this plant is an epiphyte and should not be planted into the substrate. Instead, I'm wedging it in gaps and cracks throughout the scape. I've got these two Bucephalandra species which I think will look great inside this setup. Before planting them, I need to take them out their cups and remove the nutrient-rich gel that they're grown in. This is easily done by rinsing them through some water. Now they're cleaned off, I'm going to go ahead and plant them throughout the paladarium. If you're enjoying this build or finding it useful, why not drop it a like and consider subscribing, as there'll be plenty more builds like this coming in the future. I think their small, delicate leaf size helps bring a good sense of scale to this scape. No paladarium would be complete without some moss. I've got some Java moss and some Christmas moss that I'll be using. I'm starting with the Christmas moss. I'm simply placing it in various locations throughout the tank. Next I'm going to take the Java moss and trim it up into small pieces. A small amount of moss can go a long way. By trimming it up, I'll be able to cover a large area of the tank and it will also help stimulate new growth. If you've only got a small amount of moss to work with, I highly recommend you give it a go. The paladarium is pretty much fully planted and I really like how it looks. I made sure to give the plants a light spray to stop them from drying out. I want to have a fine layer of sand in the water area of the paladarium. Before pouring it in, I'm going to take some more black filter foam and fill in any small gaps that the sand might get through. If I don't tightly pack these gaps, the sand will eventually find its way to the pump, which is definitely not ideal. With all the gaps filled, I'm now going to pour a fine layer of sand in the foreground. Now I'm going to take some small pieces of lava rock and place them throughout the sand. These will help create a more natural transition from the sand up to the larger lava rocks. I'm also placing in some even smaller ones as well. Before filling it up with water, I'm giving the tank a final spray down. I'm placing a small piece of tissue on top of the sand which I'll pour the water on top of. This will stop the water from disrupting the sand and the rocks in the foreground. With the water in, I'm now going to place in some floating plants. I've got a couple different species to add a variety of size and texture. Now it's time to add the springtails. These tiny bugs will keep the paladarium clean by eating mould and decaying matter. This is even more important in this build as I used a good amount of spiderwood which always goes through a mould phase. Now it's time to switch on the pump and see how the water flows. It flows perfectly and it was pretty much silent once all the air bubbles left the pump. I then placed on a front panel of glass and left it to grow for 4 weeks. Four weeks have passed and the paladarium is doing great. All the moss and plants have been growing in really well and there's been very little die-off. As you can see, the floating plants have multiplied a lot and I really like how they look on the surface of the water. As for the water section, there's a slight diatom and algae build-up which is completely normal. I've been doing a water change every week but haven't done any other maintenance. After cleaning off the glass and filling it back up, I think it's about time to add some inhabitants. These are 3 tiny snails from one of my aquariums and I think they'll be a perfect fit for this small tank. Why not drop some name suggestions in the comments below. Now let's take a closer look at some of the plants. The Bucephalandra is growing really well and I love the detail it brings to the scape. Slowly but surely the plants in the background are getting taller and filling out the space. As for the moss, it's slowly been growing and creeping just how I wanted it to. To my surprise, there's been very little mould inside this tank, and any mould that did pop up was quickly taken care of by the springtails. I'm really happy with how this paladarium's turned out and how it's grown in over the past month. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching. Why not check out this video as I think you might enjoy it too.